Julian Whittaker dropped Adeline Mercer's hand in front of 300 people, turned his back on his own bride, and walked straight into the arms of another woman while the wedding music still played. The whole ballroom froze. Somewhere a glass shattered. Adeline stood alone in the center of the floor, abandoned at her own engagement, and every soul in Virginia leaned in to watch her break. If you love a woman who refuses to break, subscribe now and stay to the very end. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. She did not break. That was the first thing that went wrong with everyone's evening. Adeline Mercer stood in the cleared center of the floor with her fiancé's back to her, and another woman on his arm. And she did not cry, and she did not run, and she did not press a hand to her mouth the way a ruined girl was supposed to. She simply lifted her chin and let the whole county look at her looking back. The glass that had shattered was her mother's. Eleanor Mercer had gone the color of a bedsheet against the far column, and the goblet had slipped clean out of her gloved fingers and burst on the marble, and nobody moved to clean it because nobody wanted to miss what came next. "Julian," Adeline said at once, not loud. She would not chase him across a floor with his name. He didn't stop. He was already 3 steps gone, already leading Vivian Ashcroft into the turn, already smiling that soft, ruined smile at the Charleston woman, as if the last 6 months of his life had simply been mislaid somewhere and forgotten. 10 minutes earlier, none of it had happened yet. 10 minutes earlier, Adeline had been standing beside her father at the edge of the hall, and Thomas Mercer had been squeezing her hand hard enough to hurt, and he'd been happy. That was the part she'd think about later in the dark. Her father happy. "You see, the Cavendishes came," Thomas had murmured, tipping his chin toward the doors. "And the Hales. And old Colonel Pruitt, who hasn't left his porch in 2 years. They came for you, girl. For the announcement. They came for the wine, Papa. They came for you." He'd said it fierce and low, the way he said the things that mattered. 6 months I've waited on this boy to name the date in public where it counts. 6 months of him saying soon. Tonight he names it. Tonight the Mercerland and the Whittaker name shake hands where every family for 40 miles can witness it, and no man alive can whisper afterward that my daughter was anything less than chosen. "Papa, I know you don't need it." He'd looked at her then, and his eyes had been wet, and Thomas Mercer was not a weeping man. "I know you'd be worth 10 of any of 'em standing alone. But the world don't run on what a woman's worth, Adeline. It runs on what a man'll put his name to in front of witnesses. And tonight, one finally does. Let your old father have his one good night." She'd kissed his cheek. "You'll have it." She had believed that when she said it. Across the room. Julian had caught her eye and lifted his glass to her, and she'd thought, God help her. She'd actually thought there, "You see, it's fine. You're a fool to have worried." He'd looked at her the way he'd looked at her in her father's study, half a year back, when he'd asked for her hand with his hat literally in his hands and his voice cracking on the word honor. Then the doors had opened, and Vivian Ashcroft had walked into Virginia. Adeline had watched it happen to Julian's face like watching frost climb a window pane. The warmth going, the affection going, some hungrier thing rising up underneath and taking the seat they'd left empty. Now she stood in the middle of the floor and understood that she'd watched her whole life change and had mistaken it in the moment for a draft from an open door. "Well," said a woman's voice near the wall, not lowered, meant to be heard. "There's the end of the Mercer girl. Poor thing." Another voice, sweeter, worse. "And after her father made such a production of it." Adeline turned her head and found the 2 matrons, Mrs. Pruitt and the Hale widow, both of them draped in enough silk to reef a schooner, and she held their eyes until first one, then the other, found something fascinating to study in the bottom of her glass. "Mrs. Pruitt," Adeline said, pleasant as Sunday. "How is the Colonel's gout?" The old woman went scarlet. He's much improved, thank you." "I'm so glad. Give him my warm." He always did say a person's true measure shows when the music's playing and the floor's gone quiet. Adeline let that sit exactly 1 heartbeat. "Don't you find that's true?" Mrs. Pruitt had no answer. There wasn't one. Adeline turned away from her the way you turn away from a door you've finished closing. But her hands wanted to shake. She could feel it starting in them, the fine tremor, the body's small betrayal, and she pressed her thumbs hard into the pads of her fingers inside her gloves and would not let it out. Not here. She could give this room a great many things tonight. She would not give it that. Adeline. Her mother had reached her, was gripping her arm, was speaking fast and low, with her white face close. Come away. Come away now before we'll go out the side. The carriage is... No, Mama. You cannot stand here. I can stand anywhere I please. She covered her mother's hand with her own gently and pried the fingers loose one at a time. If I walk out that side door now, I walk out ruined. I run and I hand them the ending they've dressed up to see. But if I stay... Her voice didn't shake either. She was proud of that later. If I stay, they have to keep watching a woman who won't fall down. And that Mama they don't know how to do. Look at them. They've already run out of faces. Eleanor Mercer looked at her daughter as if she'd never once seen her before. When did you... She started and couldn't finish it. Go find Papa, Adeline said. Don't let him do anything. Don't let him cross this floor and make it a brawl. It's my humiliation. I'll carry it my own way. Her mother went. And Adeline Mercer was alone in the middle of the floor again, and the orchestra played on, because the orchestra always plays on, and she had exactly one thing left to decide, which was how she meant to look while she lost everything. She decided she meant to look magnificent. She was so busy deciding it that she didn't see the man cross the room. Nathaniel Caldwell hadn't meant to come at all. He'd come because his overseer's girl was being presented, and a man didn't insult a good family over an hour of his life. So he'd taken his corner back to the wall, eyes on the doors, the way he'd stood in every room for 15 years, and he'd been counting the minutes until he could decently leave when the Whitaker boy made his little play. Nathaniel had seen 100 Julians. His own father had been the pattern they were all cut from. He watched the boy drop the girl's hand and thought with the flat contempt he kept for men who mistook cruelty for cleverness. There's a fool cutting off his own leg to spite his boot, and he reached for his hat because that was his cue to be gone. Then he saw the girl not fall. He'd expected the fall. The whole room expected it. You could feel 300 people leaning toward it, greedy for it, the way a crowd leans at a hanging. And instead, the Mercer girl had lifted her chin and taken the two clucking hens by the wall apart, with a question about a man's gout, and turned her own mother away from her, and stood there in the wreckage, looking for all the world like she was doing the county a favor by staying. Nathaniel's hand came off his hat. Huh, he said to nobody. He watched her a moment longer. He was a man who watched things land, whether horses, men, and read the truth of them under the show of them, and it was the thing he was best at. He watched the girl, and he saw the tremor she was fighting in her hands, saw her thumbs press it down, saw her choose, second by second, not to be small. And something turned over in his chest that he'd have sworn on his mother's grave had died and been buried a long time back. That's not a woman wants saving, he thought. That's a woman standing her ground alone, because not one man in this room's got the spine to stand it with her. And then a second thought came quieter, and it was the one that moved his boots. And you'll leave her to it. You'll put your hat on and ride home to your empty house and let him watch her do it by herself. He set his glass on a passing tray. Sir, said the servant. Never mind. He never did decide exactly. He'd chew on that for years. He didn't weigh it, didn't run the figures the way he ran figures on everything he'd ever touched. His boots simply started across the floor, and the crowd parted in front of him the way crowds always parted out of that stew of deference and unease he'd long since quit noticing. The whispers changed as he came. He heard them lift like crows off a fence. That's Caldwell the landowner. What in the he never, surely he ain't. He was. Adeline felt the room shift behind her and braced her spine, thinking it was worse coming some fresh cut. A shadow fell across the floor in front of her. A pair of good worn boots stopped. She looked up. She didn't know the face. She knew of him the way you know of weather in the next county. Caldwell the land baron, the one who never came, who never danced, who they said had a heart like a bank vault and about as warm. She had never once stood close enough to see that his eyes were dark and level, and that there was an old white scar through one brow, and that he was looking at her, not at the scene, not at the ruin, at her like she was still a person, and not a spectacle. He touched the brim of his hat, unhurried, and tipped it. "Miss Mercer." Low voice. It carried. A low voice carries better than a loud one in a room gone still. "Sir?" "Nathaniel Caldwell. We ain't been introduced, and I reckon this is a sorry moment to fix that, so I'll apologize up front if I'm speaking out of turn." "You are speaking out of turn." Something touched the corner of his mouth. "Figured I might be." He held her eyes. "Say the word, ma'am, and I'm gone. No harm done. I'll be a shadow you never saw." And Adeline, standing in the ruins of her own engagement, felt the first thing all night that wasn't cold. She felt curious. "Why did you come over here, Mr. Caldwell?" "You wanted honest." "I'd prefer it. Every soul in this room spent 2 minutes waiting to watch you fall down." He let it sit, and she understood he'd learned that trick from her watching. "You didn't. And I reckon a thing like that's worth more than 300 people staring at their own shoes." He put out his hand, open, palm up, steady as a table. "Would you allow me this dance, Miss Mercer?" The room stopped breathing. Behind. Adeline. The stolen waltz stumbled. The conductor had seen it. The musicians had seen it, and for 2 bars, the whole orchestra nearly lost the thread. Then it caught. It always caught. Across the floor, Julian Whittaker had gone still with Vivian on his arm. And here, for one moment, one only the human thing showed. Adeline was watching him past Nathaniel's shoulder, and she saw it plain. Julian's hand loosened on Vivian's. He half-turned. His mouth opened. For a single breath he looked like a boy who has thrown a stone he can't call back and would give his right arm to unthrow it. And she saw his weight shift toward her back, toward the woman he'd cast off, as if some buried better part of him had woken up too late and was trying to drag the rest of him back across the floor to say, "I'm sorry, God, what have I done? God, what have—" Vivian felt it. Vivian's hand tightened on his sleeve like a trap closing. "Julian." Vivian murmured sweet, so only he could hear, but Adeline read her lips. Adeline read everything. "Don't be dull. Everyone's watching. You'll look a fool crawling back to her now." And Julian's weight settled again. The boy went back under. The coward came up in his place. He turned his face away from his bride and toward the floor, and the moment died in him, and Adeline watched it die and understood something that steadied her more than any anger could have. He wasn't a monster. He was worse than a monster for her purposes. He was a weak man who'd had one good instinct and let a richer woman talk him out of it in 3 seconds flat. She could work with weak. Weak, she understood. She looked back down at the open hand in front of her. "I should tell you," she said to Nathaniel, "that dancing with me right now is a poor bet. Whatever's fallen on me tonight rubs off. That's how this county works. You touch a ruined woman, you carry a little ruin home." "I know how the county works, ma'am. I've owned a fair piece of it a good while." "Then you know what they'll say about you tomorrow." "I have never once," Nathaniel said, "arranged my doings around what they'll say. I'd think poorly of myself if I started tonight on account of you, of all people." The hand didn't waver. "I asked you a plain question. It wants a yes or a no. The whole rest of this room can go hang." Adeline Mercer looked at the hand. She looked at the man. She took it. The room let out a long, low sound, not a gasp. Exactly. 300 people releasing the ending they'd come for and grabbing after a new one they didn't have a name for. "You'll have to lead," she said quietly, as his hand closed warm and certain over hers. "I've had this waltz stolen once tonight already. I'd sooner not lose it twice. I don't aim to lose it at all." He drew her into the frame, correct grave, a careful hand's breadth of daylight between them, and she marked that he was a man who knew where the lines were and chose to honor them, and turned her out onto the floor that had been meant for her all along. "You don't come to these," she said as they moved. "That's the whisper. Caldwell never dances." "Caldwell never dances," he agreed. "So why?" He was quiet through the corner. When it came, it was truer than she'd braced for. "Because I grew up in the house where every dance was a bargain," he said, "and every kind word had a price wrote on the back of it. My father and mother used to waltz at parties just like this, smile pretty for the county, then ride home and not speak a week. I decided young, I'd rather stand in a corner my whole life than take a true thing and turn it into a show. He turned her again. So no ma'am, I don't dance, meant it all 15 years. And yet here you are. And yet, the almost smile. You went and made it worth doing, which I'll thank you not to spread. It'll wreck a reputation I worked hard on. And Adeline Mercer, who'd been certain she had no smiles left in her, tonight felt one pull at the corner of her mouth, unwilling, half angry about it, and real. I don't need rescuing, Mr. Caldwell, if that's what this is. Saw that plane, ma'am. It's the whole reason I'm out here. His hand was steady at her back. A woman needing rescue. I'd have left to it. There's a dozen men in this room would have played hero for a girl in tears. But you weren't handing 'em the girl in tears. You were standing there like a fence post in a cyclone, daring the county to knock you flat. That's not rescuing. That's... He hunted the word and found it. That's joining. The music turned. The daylight between them held. Julian's watching us, she said. I know it. You're doing this to shame him. No, ma'am. Flat and certain, and under it, she heard the man himself, the one who'd built an empire out of a wrecked house and never explained himself to a living soul. I wanted to shame that boy. I'd have done it years back, and it wouldn't have needed you. I'm out here for the reason I gave and no other. Whatever he's feeling watching us, that's his to carry. Not mine, not yours. Let him have it. It's the only thing he'll take home tonight worth having. She studied him as they moved, and she was very good at studying people. The thing she was best at, better than any man in her life, had troubled to notice, and what she found in Nathaniel Caldwell's face undid her a little. It wasn't pity. That was the thing. Julian had pitied her at the end in his soft, cruel voice. The matrons pitied her. Her own mother, God love her, had come at her with pity naked in her face. Pity was the coin they'd all decided she'd be paid in from now till the grave. Poor Adeline, poor Mercer girl. And this stranger had crossed a whole hostile floor to hand her something else instead. Respect. She hadn't been handed that by a man in longer than she could rightly remember. You said your folks waltzed for the county and rode home in silence, she said. I did. And you decided you'd rather stand in the corner. For 15 years. That's a long time to be right about a thing, Mr. Caldwell. It is. It must be a hard thing then, she said, watching his face, to be dragged out of a corner you've been right about for 15 years, by a stranger, in front of the whole county. She saw it land. Saw something shift behind the level eyes, a crack of light under a locked door. It is, ma'am, he said quietly. It surely is. I'll be honest, since you asked me to be honest to start, I don't rightly know what I'm doing out here. That's God's truth. I set my glass down and my feet went, and I followed him, and here I stand, and I've no earthly notion what I've started. Ruefler now. I'm a man who plans. I plan a harvest 3 seasons out. And I couldn't tell you what I'll do when this song ends. That makes 2 of us. They danced, and the room came over 3 slow minutes, all the way around, from waiting on a woman to fall to watching a woman refuse to something. None of them had a name for the coldest man in Virginia, dancing careful and grave with the girl his neighbor had thrown out, the both of them, plainly making it up as they went, looking nowhere but at each other. Off at the edge of it, Vivian Ashcroft was no longer smiling. She'd come to Virginia to take a thing, and she'd taken it, and it had turned to ash in her hand, inside of 5 minutes, because some cattle baron nobody could buy had walked out of a corner and made her prize look like exactly what it was, a fool who'd traded down. She watched the Mercer girl dance, and her lovely face did a thing it was not built to do in public, which was show what was under it. Who is he? Vivian said low to the woman beside her. Caldwell, Nathaniel Caldwell. Owns, oh my dear, he owns everything. More land than the Whitakers dream of. Never marries, never courts, never so much as... He's dancing. He's dancing, the woman agreed, faint. I've been coming to these 30 years. I've never seen it. Vivian Ashcroft watched a man who owned everything choose a ruined girl over the richest daughter in Charleston without so much as glancing her way. And something cold and patient settled into her that was a great deal more dangerous than the vanity she'd walked in with. She was not a woman who lost. And she had just watched herself lose to a girl in a made-over gown in front of everyone, and she meant to understand exactly how, and then she meant to see it undone. "Adeline Mercer," Vivian said, tasting it. "Well, we'll get better acquainted, she and I." The last notes came. Nathaniel stopped and stepped forward into the small, correct bow. Not the coward step back that Julian had taken, and she marked that difference too, the way she marked everything. He took her gloved hand and raised it and touched his hat. "Miss Mercer, I'm obliged. That's the first honest dance I've had in this county in my life, and I don't expect I'll get a better." Adeline looked up at him. 300 people watched. Julian watched gone gray. Vivian watched her victory turn to ash. Her own mother watched from the wall with tears standing bright, and something in her face at last that wasn't pity. Something near to awe. "Let them watch. Mr. Caldwell." Her voice was steady and clear, and it carried the length of a silent room, the way a low voice will. "You crossed a great deal of floor tonight for a woman you never met. I don't know yet what to make of you." A breath. "But I mean to find out. I'd like that, ma'am. It'll cost you. They'll talk." "Let 'em talk, Miss Mercer." He set her hand down gentle and straightened, and for the first time in 15 years, Nathaniel Caldwell smiled all the way, in a ballroom in front of everyone, and didn't care 1 inch who saw. "I've got nothing but land and time, and I find I've grown real curious how far you aim to go." She held his eyes a moment more. Then she stepped back from him, and she turned, and Adeline Mercer walked the length of that floor alone, past the matrons who'd buried her, past the girls who'd envied her past, the man who'd thrown her away, and the woman he'd thrown her away, for chin-high spine, straight on no man's arm at all. Halfway across, her father stepped out of the crowd to meet her. Thomas Mercer's face was a war. Rage in it, and shame, and under both a grief so plain, it near stopped her. He'd wanted one good night. He'd asked for one, and a weak boy had taken it out behind the barn and shot it. "Girl," he said hoarse. "Girl, I'll call him out. All the Whittakers''ll answer for." "You'll do no such thing, Papa." She took his arm. She gave him her arm. She'd think later it was she who steadied him and turned him toward the doors. "You'll walk your daughter out of here with your head up, and you'll do it slow, and you'll do it like a man who's got nothing in the world to be ashamed of. Because you don't. He does. I made a bad bargain for you. I trusted his word. I brought you here and I stood you up in front of everybody to be. You brought me here believing a man would keep his word to me. That's not your shame, Papa. A father's supposed to be able to believe that." Her voice caught just once, just for him, and steadied. "It's his. Every ounce of it's his. And I won't carry a pound of what belongs to him. Not one." Thomas Mercer looked down at his daughter, this girl he'd raised, who was walking him out of the worst night of his life, like she was the one made of oak, and whatever he'd thought he knew about her worth, she watched him revise it right there on his ruined old face. "When did you get so strong?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Tonight, I think," Adeline said. "Somewhere around the second waltz." They reached the doors. She did not look back at Julian. She did not look back at Vivian. She let herself at the very last glance once toward the far side of the hall, and Nathaniel Caldwell was still standing where she'd left him, alone in the middle of the floor, now hat in his hand, watching her go, the way a man watches weather come in off a long dry field. He tipped his hat to her again. She inclined her head just so. Then Adeline Mercer walked out into the cold Virginia night on her father's arm, ruined in the eyes of every family that mattered for 40 miles and freer than she had been in the whole 6 months she'd spent being chosen. Because she'd walked into that ballroom believing her worth was measured by whose hand she'd leave on, and she'd learned in the cruelest hour of her life that it never had been, that it never once had been, and that some things a person can only find out the night the whole world turns its back and waits for them to fall. She didn't fall. She never would again. The story reached the Caldwell house before Nathaniel did. Howe was still an hour from home, riding through the dark, with the cold biting at his collar, when word of what he'd done was already traveling faster than any horse porch to porch, kitchen to kitchen. The way news travels in a county where a man's business is everybody's supper. By the time his own housekeeper met him at the door with a lamp, Mrs. Doyle had heard it twice. "They're saying," she said, holding the door, "that you danced." I did. With the Mercer girl. The one that got... With Miss Mercer? Yes. Mrs. Doyle had kept his house 11 years and had never once seen him do a single thing the county could talk about, and she stood there with the lamp shaking a little in her hand and looked at him like he'd come home with his hair on fire. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "what in heaven possessed you?" He handed her his hat. He was quiet a moment, and she thought he wasn't going to answer at all, which was his usual way. "I couldn't tell you, Mrs. Doyle," he said finally. "I've been trying to work it out the whole ride home. When I do, you'll be the first to know." He went up to bed and didn't sleep, and that was new too. Across the county, in a house gone dark and silent. Adeline didn't sleep either. She lay in her narrow bed with her ruined engagement dress still hung over the chair where she'd left it, and she stared at the ceiling and waited for the crash to come. The shame, the tears, the collapse she'd held off all night by main force. She waited for it the way you wait for a fever to break. It never came. What came instead? Somewhere in the black middle of the night was a strange and unfamiliar quiet. She lay there and took her own measure the way she'd have taken stock of a ledger, and she found to her genuine surprise that she was not destroyed. Hurt, yes. Furious, yes, in a cold, deep way that had nowhere yet to go. But not destroyed. Something in her had gotten up off the floor tonight and refused to lie back down, and she lay in the dark and got acquainted with it. By morning, it had a shape. She came down to breakfast and found her father already at the table, gray-faced, a letter open in front of him, and his hand flat on top of it, like he could hold the words down. "Papa." "It's from Whitaker." He didn't look up. "The elder, Julian's father." "What does it say?" "It says, Thomas Mercer's jaw worked. It says that in light of last evening's unfortunate misunderstanding, and to spare both families further embarrassment, they think it best the engagement be considered quietly dissolved. No fault to anyone. A youthful change of heart." He finally looked up and his eyes were wet and terrible. A youthful change of heart, Adeline. Like the boy misplaced his hat. Adeline crossed the room and read it over his shoulder, and her eye caught on a line near the bottom that her father hadn't spoken aloud, and her blood went cold and still. "Papa, read me the last part. About the loan." He didn't want to. She watched him not want to. "Read it. And as regards the matter of the note extended to your family last spring." He read low, "Mr. Whitaker trusts that the dissolution of the arrangement will not affect the terms of repayment, which he expects to be honored in full by the autumn quarter." He set the letter down. "It's $400, girl, against the West 40. I borrowed it to make the season to make you a season on his boy's word that we'd all be one family before it came due, and no man calls in a loan on his own kin. But we're not to be kin now. No. So the note comes due. In the autumn quarter." Her father's voice was a dead flat thing. "Which I cannot make. Which he knows I cannot make. Which means he takes the West 40, which is the best water on the place, and there's not a court in Virginia will say a word against it because it's all wrote down proper, and I signed it like a trusting old fool." And there it was. Adeline stood very still and felt the whole shape of it settle over her at once, and it was worse than the ballroom, worse than the dance, worse than all of it, because the humiliation had been hers alone to carry, but this would take her father's land. This would take the ground her grandfather had cleared with his own hands. Julian hadn't just thrown her away. He'd thrown her away and left a snare behind him on his way out the door. "He planned this," she said softly. "I don't reckon the boy's got the wit to plan his own breakfast." Not the boy, the father. She was already seeing it, the whole architecture of it, the way she saw the true shape of things under their surface. He extended that note when the marriage made it safe. The second the marriage died, the note turned into a hook. Papa did the elder Whitaker seem surprised last night when Julian made his little scene. Her father frowned, thinking back. "No," he said slowly. "No, now you say it. He didn't. He was standing by the doors. He watched the whole thing, and he never so much as blinked, because he knew it was coming." Adeline's hands had gone very still on the back of the chair. "It wasn't a boy losing his head over a pretty face, Papa. Or it wasn't only that. It was a family cutting us loose at the exact moment cutting us loose turned $400 into 40 acres of the best water in the valley. The silence in that kitchen was a live thing. "Then we're finished," Thomas Mercer said. "No. Adeline, we are not finished." She said it the way she'd stood in the ballroom chin up, and her father heard the ballroom in it. "I don't know yet how, but I know this men like the Whitakers only win when the people they're robbing agree to feel robbed. When you go quiet and ashamed and you slink off and let them write the story. Well." She picked up the terrible letter and folded it crisp and put it in her own pocket. "I'm not going quiet, and I'm keeping this. A man ought to be careful what he puts in writing." 2 days later the invitation came. Not to Adeline, to the county. The Ashcrofts of Charleston, it seemed, were extending their stay in Virginia, and Vivian Ashcroft would be received at the Whitaker estate on Saturday next, and all the good families were welcome to come and pay their respects to the visiting jewel of the Low Country. The message underneath it was plain as day, and twice as cruel. The throne was filled. The Mercer girl was replaced. Come and see the new queen. The whole county understood they were being invited to a coronation. The whole county also understood that the one family conspicuously not invited was the Mercers, and that the pointed absence of the invitation was itself the point. Adeline read about it from her mother, who'd heard it from the Hale widow, who'd made a special trip to deliver the news, wearing an expression of such deep and pleasurable sympathy that Eleanor Mercer had wanted to slap her. "You're not to go anywhere near it," Eleanor said. "It's a trap dressed as a party. That woman wants you to come and be humiliated all over again, and I won't have—" "I'm going," Adeline said. "You are not." "I wasn't invited, Mama. How could I go?" Adeline smiled, and it was not entirely a nice smile. "No. I'll be somewhere else that evening, somewhere far more interesting, because on Friday." The day before Vivian's coronation, a rider had come up the Mercer lane with a note, and the note was in a hand. Adeline didn't know, spare and plain and pressing hard on the paper, and it read, "Miss Mercer, I find I've got a matter of business I'd value your eye on if you'd permit a call. I'm told you know land and figures better than most men in this valley. I've reason to think it's true. N. Caldwell." She read it 4 times. "Business," her mother said, reading it over her shoulder, and there was a whole world of doubt in the word. "A man doesn't cross a ballroom for business, Adeline." "Maybe not." Adeline folded the note. "But a man might use business as a decent way to knock on a door he's got no other excuse to knock on. And I find I'd rather be asked for my mind than my hand, Mama. It's been a long while since anyone asked for either." He came Saturday afternoon, the very hour. As it happened, that half the county was rolling up the Whitaker Drive to bow at Vivian Ashcroft. He came on horseback alone, no fanfare, and he took his hat off before he reached the porch and held it in both hands. The whole time he talked to her father in the yard, respectful, and Thomas Mercer came back inside, looking like a man who'd seen a mule recite scripture. "I wants to talk to you," Thomas said. "About the low pasture over on his east line. Says it floods every spring, and he's lost 2 seasons of hay to it, and he's heard you've got a head for drainage." He shook his own head. "Nathaniel Caldwell rode 10 miles to ask my daughter about drainage." "Then I'd best not keep him waiting," Adeline said, and went out. They sat on the porch because it wasn't proper to do otherwise, with her mother watching through the window pretending to darn, and they talked. And here was the thing that undid Adeline more than any flattery could have. He had come about the pasture. He laid out the problem plain. The low ground, the spring flood, the 2 lost seasons, and he wasn't making it up, and he wasn't playing at it. He genuinely wanted to know what she thought. So she told him. She told him about grading and cross-ditching, about where the water wanted to go, if a man would only stop fighting it and dig it a path, about a thing her grandfather had done on the Mercer bottoms that had turned swamp into the best hay ground on the place. She talked for a quarter hour without stopping, forgetting to be careful, forgetting to be ruined, forgetting everything but the problem. And when she came back to herself and remembered who she was talking to, she stopped short, embarrassed. "Forgive me, I've been running on." "Don't." Nathaniel had leaned forward at some point, elbows on his knees, had forgotten in his hands, and he was looking at her the way a man looks at good water after a dry spell. That's the most sense I've heard talked about that ground in 10 years. My overseer's been telling me to give up on it. You've just told me how to save it in 15 minutes on a porch. It's only drainage, Mr. Caldwell. It's not only anything. He straightened. Miss Mercer, I'll be plain because I told you I'd always be plain with you, and I mean to keep to it. I did come about the pasture. Every word of it's true. But I'd be a liar if I said the pasture was the whole of why I'm sitting on your porch, and I don't take you for a woman who'd thank me for a lie, however polite. Adeline's heart did something she didn't give it leave to do. She kept her face still. Then why else, Mr. Caldwell? Because I can't get you out of my head, he said, and I've decided I'd rather sit on your porch and find out why than spend another week pretending I can. There it was, laid flat on the boards between them, and neither of them looked away from it. That's a dangerous thing to say to a ruined woman, Adeline said quietly. I keep hearing that word from you. Ruined. Nathaniel turned his hat once in his hands. I've been on this land my whole life, ma'am, and I've watched 100 storms come through and flatten what looked like the strongest crop in the field and leave standing the one everybody'd written off. Ruin's a word other people put on you. It don't have to be a word you answer to. He met her eyes. You didn't answer to it in that ballroom. I watched you refuse it in front of 300 people, so I'll thank you not to start answering to it now on your own porch where nobody's even asking you to. And Adeline Mercer, who had held her composure through the worst public humiliation of her life, felt her eyes sting hot and sudden on her own front porch in the quiet afternoon, and had to look away toward the yard until it passed. When she trusted her voice again, she said, There's something you should know before you go crossing any more rooms or riding any more miles on my account. It'll change your figuring. I'm listening. So she told him. About the note. About the $400 and the West 40 and the autumn quarter and the trap the elder Whitaker had left snapping shut behind his son. She told it flat and clear, the whole architecture of it, and she watched his face while she did, and his face got very still and very hard in a way she hadn't seen on it before. Let me be sure I've got it, he said when she'd finished. Whitaker loaned your father money on the strength of a marriage. Then the day after his boy breaks that marriage in the most public way a man could contrive. The father calls the note, which comes due at a season. Your father can't make, and takes your best ground for $400, it's worth 10 times over. That's the shape of it. And it's all wrote down legal, every word. My father signed it in good faith. It's ironclad. Nathaniel Caldwell sat very still on the Mercer porch, and Adeline watched something move behind his eyes that she wouldn't have wanted aimed at her. The cold of a man who'd fought for every acre he had and knew exactly how the fight was rigged. I could buy the note, he said slowly. I could ride to Whitaker tomorrow and buy that paper off him for the $400 and tear it up in your father's kitchen and be done with it. No, Adeline said. He blinked. No, no. And here she leaned forward now, and her voice came fast and certain. And this was the moment the man on the porch stopped seeing a woman who'd been wronged and started seeing the woman she actually was. You buy that note and tear it up, and you've solved one afternoon's trouble, and cost me everything that matters. Because then, the story the county tells is that the ruined Mercer girl got saved twice by Nathaniel Caldwell, danced out of one disgrace, and bought out of the next. I'd be a woman 2 men had cause to talk about, and neither of the reasons would be my own doing. She shook her head hard. I don't want the note bought, Mr. Caldwell. I want it beaten. There's a difference, and it's the whole difference in the world to me. Beaten how it's legal paper. It's legal paper, written by a family that thinks it's untouchable, drawn up by lawyers who never once imagined the person on the other side of it would be a woman who reads every line and knows what she's looking at. Adeline's eyes had gone bright and hard. Men like the Whitakers get careless, Mr. Caldwell, because they've never in their lives been made to answer for a comma. And I have read that note 4 times, and there is something wrong in it. I don't have the whole of it yet. But there is a thread in it, and I mean to pull it, and when I pull it, I mean to be the one holding the end, not you, not my father, not any man riding to my rescue, me. Nathaniel Caldwell looked at her a long moment. Then he did a thing she didn't expect. He laughed short, surprised real, and shook his head, and put his hat back on, and stood. All right, he said. All right. All right, Miss Mercer. You don't want the note bought, I won't buy it. You want to beat it your own self, I'll not lift a finger to stop you. He came down a step, then turned back. But I'll say this. You find that thread you're after, and you find you need a thing. A woman can't easily get in this county. A lawyer to see you, a clerk to open his records, a man of standing to stand up in a room and say, I've looked at this, and it's crooked, you send for me. Not to save you, to back you. There's a difference in that too, and I reckon you know it better than I do. Adeline stood as well. Why would you do that? Stake your name on a fight that isn't yours against a family you have to live beside. He was quiet a moment. My father spent 30 years taking things off people who couldn't fight back, Nathaniel said. Land mostly, same as Whitaker's fixing to do to yours. Same paper, same tricks, same untouchable smile. I watched him do it my whole growing up, and I never once had the standing or the sand to stop him. He put a hand on the porch rail. I've got both now. And I find I'd sleep easier for the rest of my life if I spent a little of it standing between a family and the exact machine that made me who I am. That answer your question? It did. It answered a good deal more than she'd asked. He rode off, and Adeline stood on the porch a long while after the dust settled, and her mother came out and stood beside her without a word, and the two of them watched the empty lane. He didn't ask for your hand, Eleanor said at last. No. He asked for your mind. Her mother's voice was strange. Adeline, in 30 years of watching men in this county, I've never once seen one do that. Ask a woman for her mind, like it was worth more than her face. I know it, Mama. You be careful, Eleanor said, but it wasn't a warning against him. It was a warning against hope. A woman can survive losing a man like Julian. She loses a man like that one, it takes something else with it. Adeline didn't answer. She was already thinking about the note in her pocket and the thread she'd promised to pull, and the coronation happening 10 miles off at the Whitaker estate that very hour, where Vivian Ashcroft was being crowned queen of a county that hadn't the faintest idea a war had just been declared on its front porch. She didn't have long to wait to feel the war's first shot. It came Monday, in the form of the Hale widow, again breathless with the joy of bad news, sitting in the Mercer parlor and delivering it with her teacup balanced just so. I don't know how to tell you this, dear. I truly don't, but I'd want to be told so. A sip. A pause built for maximum cruelty. Miss Ashcroft has been saying things about you at the Whitaker gathering, in front of everyone. Adeline set down her own cup with a steady hand. What sort of things, Mrs. Hale? Oh, I couldn't repeat well. She repeated them. She said that a woman who'd throw herself at a man like Caldwell the very night her own engagement collapsed shows exactly the kind of character that lost her the engagement in the first place. She said, forgive me, she said it was no wonder Julian looked elsewhere if the girl would land on the next rich man before the music even stopped. She said, and here the widow's eyes glittered, that the whole county could see what you were now. Eleanor Mercer came halfway out of her chair. That poisonous little mama. Adeline hadn't moved. Sit down. She sat trembling with rage. Adeline looked at the Hale widow across the teacups, and she understood several things all at once, and very clearly. She understood that Vivian Ashcroft had won the man and the coronation, and was still 4 days later spending her considerable energy trying to grind a ruined girl further into the dirt, which meant Vivian was not triumphant at all. Vivian was frightened. You do not keep kicking a thing you've beaten. You keep kicking a thing you're afraid might get back up. And she understood that the Hale widow had come here not out of any friendship, but to watch Adeline's face crumple. She declined to give her the pleasure. Mrs. Hale, Adeline said pleasantly, may I tell you something in confidence that you may of course repeat to anyone you like? The widow leaned in hungry. Of course, dear. Miss Ashcroft is quite right that the whole county can see what I am now. Adeline smiled. I hadn't realized it myself until this very week. But she's done me a great service in naming it, and I find I'm grateful to her. She let it hang. I'm a woman who was thrown away by a weak man in front of everyone, and who did not fall down. That's what the county can see. And if Miss Ashcroft is spending her time as the new mistress of the county, telling everyone how little I matter, well, the smile sharpened. I'd only observed that a woman who's truly won doesn't waste her breath on a woman who's truly lost. You might mention that if it comes up. In confidence, of course. The Hale widow left considerably less pleased than she'd arrived, which was the first genuinely satisfying thing that had happened to Adeline in a week. But under the satisfaction, a colder current was running, and Adeline felt it the moment the parlor door closed. Vivian's cruelty wasn't idle. Vivian had a reason to want her not just beaten, but buried past all getting up, and Adeline didn't yet know what it was, and not knowing it was dangerous. She found out sooner than she'd have liked. That night, going through her father's papers by candlelight, hunting the thread in the note, reading every document in the box. He kept the deeds in. She found something that didn't belong. A single sheet folded small that had been tucked in among the Mercer deeds where it had no business being. It was a copy of a survey, not of Mercerland, of Caldwell's East Line, the very low pasture Nathaniel had ridden 10 miles to ask her about, and it was marked. Someone had gone over the boundary in fresh ink and moved it just slightly, just enough so that the good bottomland, the ground she'd told Nathaniel how to drain and save, fell, not inside the Caldwell line, but outside it. On the wrong side. Available. Adeline sat very still with the candle guttering and her heart going hard. Her father hadn't put this here. Her father had never seen Caldwell's survey in his life. Someone had put it in the Mercer deed box, had been in this house, and had left it where it would look to any lawyer or clerk who came looking, as though the Mercers had been quietly plotting to lay claim to a strip of Nathaniel Caldwell's best flooded ground. It was a frame. A clumsy one, but a frame. And if it surfaced at the wrong moment, it would do exactly what it was built to do. Turn the one man of standing, willing to back her, into a man who believed she'd been playing him for his land all along. It would sever the single thread that connected her to any hope of fighting the Whitaker note. And only 2 people knew she and Nathaniel had spoken of that pasture at all. Herself and Nathaniel. Which meant someone had been listening. Someone had been close enough to the porch, or close enough to Nathaniel's own household, to know the one piece of ground that would make the trap fit. Adeline folded the survey back exactly as she'd found it, and blew out the candle, and sat in the dark of her father's study, with her pulse loud in her ears, and understood that she was no longer fighting a broken engagement or even a crooked loan. She was fighting someone who came into houses, and whoever it was had just made one mistake, the same mistake the Whitakers had made with the note, the same mistake powerful people always made when they'd never once been caught. They'd left it in writing, and they'd left it where the one person in the county who read every line before she signed it would be the one to find it. Adeline Mercer sat in the dark and did not feel afraid. She felt for the first time since the music stopped in that ballroom entirely and terribly clear. They had come into her father's house. They had reached for the one hand that had been offered to her in good faith and tried to poison it. They had decided that a thrown-away woman was safe to rob, safe to slander, safe to frame, because a thrown-away woman had nothing left to fight with and no one left to fight for her. They were about to learn how wrong a county full of careful, comfortable, clever people could be about a quiet woman who reads every line. She lit the candle again. She took out a clean sheet of paper, and in her spare, plain, hard-pressing hand, Adeline Mercer began to write down everything she knew: the note, the survey, the timing, the names, building the first page of the case that was going to bring the whole rotten machine down around the ears of every soul who'd stood in that ballroom and waited for her to fall. She did not send for Nathaniel Caldwell. That was the first hard decision, and she made it before the candle had burned another inch. Every instinct she'd been raised with said to send the rider at first light, to lay the survey in front of the one man with the standing, to help her, to let him see it before it could be used against her. That was the sensible thing. That was what a woman with no power did. She ran to the nearest man who had some. Adeline sat with the folded survey in her hand and made herself think it through the other way. If she rode to Nathaniel with it, she'd be the woman who came running the moment trouble found her. Worse, if whoever planted that paper was watching the roads, and she had every reason now to think they were, then a Mercer rider tearing up the Caldwell lane at dawn was exactly the picture the frame needed. It would look like guilt. It would look like a woman scrambling to explain herself before the survey surfaced on its own. She'd be handing her enemy the very scene they'd built the trap to produce. No. She'd hold the survey. She'd keep it exactly where she'd found it in her father's deed box, and she'd let whoever planted it believe it was still sleeping there, waiting to be discovered by the right pair of hostile hands. And in the meantime, she'd do the one thing they clearly didn't expect a thrown-away woman to do. She'd investigate. She started at the only place a woman in her position could start without raising a single eyebrow: church. Sunday came, and Adeline put on her plainest gray and walked into the meeting house on her father's arm with her chin level, and she felt the whole congregation shift and murmur and pretend not to watch her the way they'd pretended not to watch her in the ballroom. She let them. She'd learned that trick now for good, that if you simply refused to be ashamed, the shame had nowhere to land, and it curdled instead in the people who'd meant to make you feel it. What she'd come for was not the sermon. She'd come because everyone came: the Whitakers, the Hales, the Pruitts, the whole machinery of the county, and because after the service they'd all mill about in the yard and talk, and a woman standing quiet at the edge of a crowd hears a very great deal that a man in the middle of it never does. She'd learned that too over 23 years of being overlooked. Being invisible had cost her plenty. It was about time it started paying her back. So she stood at the edge, and she listened. She listened to the Hale widow tell 3 different women that Vivian Ashcroft had all but moved into the Whitaker estate, and that a second announcement was expected before the month was out. And wasn't it a mercy the Mercer business had sorted itself so tidy? She listened to 2 men from the land office talk low about how the elder Whitaker had been down at the clerk's twice that week, and how a man didn't spend that much time with a records clerk. Unless he was moving paper, he didn't want moved in daylight. And she listened from 6 feet away, and with her face turned carefully toward the churchyard oak, to Julian Whitaker's own voice, tight and low, saying to someone she couldn't see, "Not what we agreed. My father said the note was a formality. He never said anything about actually taking the Mercer ground. I won't have my name on that. It's one thing to end it's another to rob the man." And the answer in a woman's voice, smooth as poured cream. "Your name's already on it, darling. Your name went on it the night you walked away from her. You don't get to keep the walking away and give back the rest. That's not how it works." Adeline knew the voice. She'd heard it 4 days ago in a ballroom telling Julian not to be dull. Vivian. Adeline kept her face toward the oak and her breath even, and her whole being bent toward the 2 of them like a divining rod. "You don't understand," Julian was saying, and there was a thread of something almost like panic in it now. "If it comes out that we timed the note to that we planned it. Adeline's not a fool, Vivian. She reads everything. If she ever puts it together. She won't. She's a thrown-off girl licking her wounds. And even if she did, who'd listen? Who in this county takes the word of a jilted woman over the Whitaker name?" A pause. "The only danger she ever posed walked her off that floor Saturday, and I've already seen to him." Adeline's blood went cold and still. "I've already seen to him." "Seen to him how?" Julian's voice sharpened. "Vivian, what did you do?" "Nothing you need trouble yourself over. Let's just say that by the time Nathaniel Caldwell's finished being reminded what the Mercer girl really is, he won't cross a room for her again. He'll cross it the other way." Adeline stood at the edge of the churchyard and understood all at once the whole of it. The survey in her father's deed box wasn't a frame meant to be found by a lawyer someday. It was a frame meant to be found by Nathaniel. Vivian meant to put that doctored survey in front of Nathaniel Caldwell to show him that the woman he'd danced with, the woman who'd talked to him so knowledgeably about his own flooded pasture, had been quietly plotting to take a strip of that very ground. She meant to turn the one honest thing that had happened to Adeline all week into the proof that Adeline was a schemer. She meant to make Nathaniel believe he'd been played, and the cruelest part, the part that made Adeline's hands curl slowly into fists at her sides, was that it would work. It would work because it was clever. Nathaniel had ridden 10 miles to ask her about that pasture. He'd told her his overseer wanted to give up on it. He'd told her it had cost him 2 seasons of hay. A man who'd confided all that then saw a doctored survey showing the Mercer name reaching for the good ground wouldn't think frame. He'd think fool that he'd let a pretty problem solver charm him into showing his hand. And a proud man who thinks he's been made a fool doesn't ask questions. He just closes the door and never opens it again. She had perhaps days, maybe less. She did not run to her father. She did not run to Nathaniel. She stood in the churchyard until her breathing was her own again, and then she walked over calm as Sunday to the two men from the land office she'd been listening to earlier, and she smiled at the elder of them, a Mr. Renfrew who'd known her grandfather. "Mr. Renfrew, how's your wife's hip? Miss Adeline." He tipped his hat, flustered. Half the county still didn't know how to look at her. "She's mending, thank you kindly." "I'm glad. Mr. Renfrew, might I trouble you with a small question? My father's got some old boundary business he's been fretting over, and I told him I'd ask a man who'd know. When a survey's amended, when a line gets moved on paper, there's a record of it, isn't there? An original the amendment's copied from, and a note of who ordered the change and when." "Course there is." Renfrew warmed to it the way a man warms to being the one who knows. "Can't just move a line, Miss Adeline. Every amendment's dated and initialed and filed against the original. The clerk keeps both. Has to. Otherwise, any rascal with a pen could redraw the whole county. And if someone did try it, drew up an amendment that was never properly filed, never dated against the original, that would show like a wolf in a hen house." Renfrew chuckled, then caught something in her face and sobered. "Miss Adeline, is somebody's father in trouble over a line?" "I hope not, Mr. Renfrew." She kept her smile. "That's rather what I'm trying to find out. Would you be able to tell if I brought you a survey whether it was a true filed amendment or a forgery, just as a favor to an old friend of my grandfather's?" Renfrew looked at her a long moment, and something shrewd and kind moved in his weathered face. "Bring it round to the office Wednesday," he said quietly. "Come at noon when the clerk's gone to his dinner, and Miss Adeline," he lowered his voice, "if it's the Whitaker business, you didn't hear it from me, but that clerk's been paid to look the other way about a thing or two this month. You watch who you show your paper to. Show it to the wrong man, it disappears, and so does whatever it'd prove." There it was. The thread she'd promised to pull, and the first hand reaching to help her pull it, and the first warning that the machine had more moving parts than she'd known. "Noon Wednesday," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Renfrew. Give your wife my warmest." She walked back to her father, with her heart going hard and her face perfectly serene, and Thomas Mercer, who'd watched the whole exchange from across the yard without hearing a word of it, said only, "You've got a look about you, girl." "What look is that, Papa?" "The look your grandmother used to get," he said, "right before somebody who'd wronged her found out they'd made a bad mistake." Wednesday, she took the doctored survey to Renfrew at noon, and Renfrew spread it on the land office table beside the original, the true original, pulled from the files, while the paid clerk ate his dinner across the square, and the two of them bent over the papers together, and Renfrew's face went from curious to grim to something close to angry. "Here," he said, tapping the doctored sheet. "You see it, lines moved sure enough right where you said, taking in the low bottom. But look at the filing mark. This amendment's dated the 4th. And here's the true survey, and the last real amendment to the Caldwell East line was filed 2 years ago, and there's been nothing since. So where'd this come from?" He straightened. "It was never filed, Miss Adeline. It's a copy of the real survey with the line redrawn by hand, and a false date stamped on it to make it look official. It's a forgery, plain and clean. And it's not even a good one. Whoever did it used the wrong ink for the date. Office ink's got a blue cast. This is black. A clerk'd catch it in a heartbeat. Unless," Adeline said slowly, "the clerk was paid not to catch it." Renfrew's mouth thinned. "Unless that." "Mr. Renfrew." She kept her voice steady, though her pulse was loud. "Who would have to have handled the true survey to make a copy this good? It's not something a person could do from memory. They'd have needed the real one in front of them. Only 3 sets exist. One's here in the file. One belongs to Mr. Caldwell himself." Renfrew paused. "And one's held by the man who did the original survey, 20 years back. Old Pettigrew. Died last winter. His papers went to his son-in-law when the estate settled." "And who's his son-in-law?" Renfrew looked at her. "Man named Ashcroft," he said. "Charleston family. Married Pettigrew's girl a few years back and took over managing the old man's affairs. I only know because the deed transfers came through here." The room went very quiet. Ashcroft. Vivian Ashcroft hadn't come to Virginia by chance, chasing a wedding. Vivian Ashcroft's own family held the third copy of the survey. The one copy of Nathaniel Caldwell's boundary that existed outside the land office and outside Nathaniel's own house. She hadn't needed to break into anyone's home to get the map she'd redrawn. She'd had it all along sitting in her father's papers, a gift from a dead surveyor, which meant this wasn't some spur-of-the-moment cruelty cooked up after the ballroom. Vivian had come north with the tools to do this already in her trunk. She'd known before she ever laid eyes on Adeline Mercer that the Caldwell East line was the soft place to strike, because a woman whose family held that survey had spent years learning exactly which of the county's boundaries could be quietly moved. Adeline stood in the land office and felt the whole thing tilt and rearrange itself into a shape 10 times larger than she'd feared. "Mr. Renfrew," she said, "how many other lines in this county might have been moved the same way by someone holding old Pettigrew's papers and a clerk who'd look the other way?" Renfrew went pale. "Lord," he said softly, "I hadn't Miss Adeline if somebody's got the Pettigrew surveys and a bought clerk they could be redrawing half the West County." Quiet. A strip here, a strip there. Taking the good bottom off a dozen farms, and nobody the wiser till the taxman comes with a map that don't match the fence. He sat down heavily. "That's not a spat between families. That's a land grab. A big one. And my father's note," Adeline said, "is a piece of it. They call the Mercer note, 'Take the West 40, which is the best water on our place.' They plant a forged survey to poison the one man who might stand against them. And somewhere in the Pettigrew papers, I'd wager there's a redrawn line for every good farm in the valley that ever borrowed $1 from the Whitakers." Renfrew looked up at her, and there was fear in his face now. Real fear. The fear of a small, honest man who's just glimpsed how big and how patient the thing he's brushed up against really is. "Miss Adeline, you can't fight this. You understand me. You're one girl with one forged survey and a note you can't pay. They've got the money and the clerk and the name and half the county in their debt. You take this to a magistrate, they'll bury you. They'll say the Mercer girl's gone bitter and started spreading tales because she lost her man. They'll make you the story, and they'll win, because they always win, because that's what all that money's for. I know it. Then let it go. Let him take the 40. Save your father the rest." Adeline gathered up the forged survey and folded it and put it away. "No, Mr. Renfrew," she said. "I don't think I will." "Girl, you said it yourself. They always win because they make the wronged person into the story. Because they count on the shame, on the running, on a jilted woman going quiet." She looked at him steady. "But I'm not going quiet, and I'm not going to be the story. I'm going to make them the story. And to do that, I don't need a magistrate to believe one bitter girl. I need him to look at 2 pieces of paper side by side, the real survey, and the false one, the wrong ink and the missing filing, and see the thing with his own eyes the way you just did. Truth doesn't need me to be liked, Mr. Renfrew. It just needs to be shown. Will you say what you told me today? In a room to the right man when the time comes." Renfrew was quiet a long moment. "Old Pettigrew," he said finally. "He surveyed your grandfather's bottoms back in the day. Fair man. He'd turn in his grave to know his life's work got used for this." He nodded slowly. "Aye, I'll say it. God help me, I'll say it. When you've got the right room and the right man, you send for me. I will. You'll need more than me, though. You'll need somebody with standing enough that they can't just be shouted down. Somebody the county can't afford to call a liar." He looked at her shrewdly. "You'll need Caldwell." And there it was, the very thing she'd been circling all week, the reef under the water. "Caldwell may not be willing," she said carefully. "Miss Ashcroft has been at some pains to see that he isn't. She means to show him that forged survey and tell him I schemed for his land. If she reaches him before I do, I lose him, and I lose the one man whose word could carry this." Renfrew frowned. "Then reach him first. It's not so simple. If I ride to him now and say, 'Don't believe the paper, Vivian's going to show you I'm innocent,' before he's ever seen the paper, I look like exactly what she'll call me. A schemer getting out ahead of her own scheme." Adeline shook her head. "No. He can't hear it from me first. He has to see it himself. He has to be the one who catches the forgery. If I hand him the answer, he'll doubt it. If he finds it, he'll believe it to his bones, and a man who's caught a lie himself is the fiercest witness you can have, because then it's his truth, not just mine." Renfrew stared at her, and slowly, something like admiration came up under the fear in his face. "You think like your grandmother," he said. "God have mercy on the Whitakers." She left the land office with the forged survey in her pocket and a plan taking shape in her head, and she'd made it not 50 yards down the square when the plan met its first hard test, because coming out of the milliner's directly into her path, unavoidable close enough to touch, was Vivian Ashcroft herself. For a heartbeat, neither woman moved. Then Vivian smiled, and it was a beautiful smile, and it had nothing behind it but frost. "Miss Mercer, what a surprise. I'd have thought you'd want to keep out of town a while yet. People do talk so." "Miss Ashcroft." Adeline inclined her head, perfectly composed. "I find I've a good deal of business in town these days, more than I'd expected even." Something flickered behind Vivian's eyes. "Business. This and that. Old papers. Boundaries. You know how tangled these county affairs can get." Adeline watched her closely as she said it, and had the small, fierce satisfaction of seeing Vivian go very still. "I'm told the smallest error in a survey can undo the whole thing. Wrong date. Wrong ink even. Isn't that curious? That a whole land claim can hang on the color of a clerk's ink." Vivian Ashcroft's beautiful face did not change, but her gloved hand tightened on her reticule, and Adeline saw it and knew she'd struck. "You've become very interested in surveys, Miss Mercer, for a woman with hardly any land left to survey." "Have I? Perhaps I'm simply interested in fairness, Miss Ashcroft. I find I've developed a taste for it lately. It's a wonderful thing to discover when the whole world's told you you don't deserve any." Adeline smiled, gentle and terrible. "You should try it sometime. I understand it's very freeing." For one moment, the mask slipped, and Adeline saw the real Vivian underneath. Not the jewel of Charleston, not the poised beauty, but a calculating woman who had just realized 4 days too late that the thrown-away girl she'd meant to grind into the dirt had somehow gotten hold of a shovel and started digging in a direction Vivian had never once imagined she'd know to dig. "Whatever you think you've found," Vivian said low, and the cream had curdled out of her voice entirely now. "You'd do well to remember what you are and what I am, and which of us this county will believe. You're a jilted girl with a chip on her shoulder. I'm going to be the mistress of the biggest estate in the valley. You put yourself in front of the wrong people with your little papers and your clever questions, and I promise you, Adel, over your father's head, and your good name along with it, and there won't be a soul in Virginia who'll cross a room for you again." Adeline held her ground and held her eyes and did not so much as blink. "You keep saying that," she said quietly, "that no one will cross a room for me. You said something very like it in the ballroom, didn't you? You told Julian he'd look a fool crawling back. You're very fond of that idea. That a woman's worth is measured by whether some man will cross a room to reach her." She tilted her head. "Here's what you've never understood, Miss Ashcroft, and it's going to cost you everything. I don't need a single man to cross a single room. I crossed the whole floor myself the night your Julian left me standing on it. I walked out of that ballroom on no one's arm at all, and I've been walking under my own power ever since." She stepped past her clothes and paused. "You should worry less about who'll cross a room for me, and a great deal more about what I'll find when I cross one for myself." She walked on, and did not look back, and left Vivian Ashcroft standing in the middle of the square with the frost cracking off her face, and something underneath it that was for the first time unmistakably fear. It was the last clean victory Adeline would have for a while, because that night the ground shifted under her again. She came home to find a carriage in the yard she didn't recognize, and her father in the parlor, gone gray as ash, and sitting across from him, hat on his knee, and his long face, grave a man she'd never met, but knew at once by the cut of his clothes and the cold in his eyes for what he was, the elder Whitaker, Julian's father, the architect. "Adeline," her father said, and his voice was wrong. "Mr. Whitaker's come with an offer. Miss Mercer." The old man rose unhurried and gave her a bow so correct it was an insult. "I'll be brief as I see the hour's late. I've come to spare your family a great deal of grief. The note on your father's land comes due this autumn, and we both know it can't be met. I'm prepared to be generous. I'll forgive the note, the whole 400, the West 40, all of it, and your family keeps every acre." He smiled thinly. "In exchange for one small thing. And what small thing is that, Mr. Whitaker? Your silence." The smile vanished. "I'm aware you've been in town, asking questions, poking at old surveys, troubling honest clerks. I'm aware you fancy yourself to have discovered something." He spread his hands. "I don't much care whether you have or you haven't. I care that it stops. You sign a paper agreeing to drop all inquiry into any matter concerning my family or my affairs, permanent and binding, and I tear up your father's note in this room tonight. Your land is saved. Your father dies a landowner. All it costs you is to let go of a grievance that will destroy you if you don't." He let it settle. "That's a kinder bargain than you got from my son, Miss Mercer. I'd think hard before I turned it down." And there it was, the twist inside the twist, the trap under the trap. Not a threat, a temptation. The cruelest thing he could possibly have offered, because it was real. He would forgive the note. Her father would keep the land. Everything her family stood to lose, saved for the price of walking away from the truth, of letting the machine roll on and grind up the next dozen farms in the valley, of unknowing everything she'd learned. Her father was looking at her with naked pleading in his old face. He didn't know what she knew. He only knew a man had come to save his land, the land his own father had cleared, and all his daughter had to do was let go of a fight she'd started. "Papa," Adeline said gently, "would you leave us a moment? Mr. Whitaker and I have some business to settle between us." Thomas Mercer hesitated. Then he rose and touched his daughter's shoulder and went out, and it was the greatest act of faith of his life, she knew, to walk out of that room and leave his land in his daughter's hands. She would remember it always. When the door closed, Adeline sat down across from the elder Whitaker and folded her hands and looked at him with a calm that unsettled him more than any anger could have. "You've done this before," she said. It wasn't a question. The old man's eyes narrowed. "Done what?" "This. Exactly this. The note, the timing, the visit in the night with the generous offer and the paper to sign. How many farms, Mr. Whitaker? How many families have you sat across from just like this and offered to save what you were about to steal in exchange for their silence? It's very efficient. You don't even have to take the land. You just have to own the fear. And a family that's signed away its right to ever ask a question is a family you can bleed slow for the rest of its days." She tilted her head. "The Pettigrew surveys made it simple, didn't they? Once Vivian's people brought them north. A redrawn line for every good bottom in the valley, and a clerk paid to swear they were true. You're not calling my father's note to take 40 acres. You're calling it to test whether the machine still works. I'm the machine's first test with a woman who reads every line." The elder Whitaker had gone very still. "You have no idea," he said softly, "how much larger this is than you, girl. You have no idea whose interests you're standing in front of. I came here tonight to help you. To let you and your father off the hook out of respect for a fight you can't win. Refuse me, and I promise you I will not be so kind twice. I'll take the 40. Then I'll take the rest. Then I'll make certain that the name Mercer means in this county the family that lied about their betters and lost everything for it. Your father will die landless and disgraced, and you'll have done it to him chasing a truth nobody wanted told. Perhaps." Adeline stood. "But here's what you've miscalculated, Mr. Whitaker, and it's the same thing your future daughter-in-law miscalculated in the square today, and the same thing your son miscalculated in the ballroom. You've all built your whole lives on one belief, that when a person's got everything to lose, they'll go quiet to keep it. That fear buys silence. It's a good bet. It's paid you handsomely, I'm sure, for 30 years. She walked to the parlor door and opened it. "But you made that bet against the wrong woman at the wrong hour of her life. Because I already lost everything I was afraid to lose. I lost it in front of 300 people 4 days ago on a ballroom floor. And do you know what I learned, Mr. Whitaker, standing there with my whole world walked away from me?" She smiled. "I learned there's nothing left you can threaten me with. You can't frighten a woman who's already been to the bottom and found out she can stand on it. Now get out of my father's house, and take your kind offer with you. I intend to earn my land back, not buy my silence with it." The Elder. Whitaker rose slowly and gathered his hat, and at the door he paused and looked back at her. And for the first time, the cold contempt in his face was shot through with something else. The dawning, unwelcome recognition of a man who's just understood that the small obstacle he came to remove is not going to move. "You'll regret this," he said, "every day for the rest of your life." "I've regretted things before," Adeline said. "Regret's survivable. Cowardice isn't. Good night, Mr. Whitaker." He went. She stood in the empty parlor, and shook now finally alone with no one to see, and let herself shake for exactly 1 minute by the clock, because she'd just turned down the salvation of her father's land, and there was no taking it back. And if she was wrong, if she couldn't win this, she'd cost her father everything with her own 2 hands and her own stiff neck. Then she stopped shaking, and she went and found her father, where he was waiting in the kitchen with his hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, and she sat down across from him and told him everything. The note timed to the ballroom, the forged survey, the Pettigrew papers, and the bought clerk, and the land grab, and Renfrew and Vivian in the square, and the offer she'd just refused in his own parlor. She watched his face the whole time, watched it go from confusion to horror, to something she hadn't expected, which was a slow, fierce, terrible pride. "You turned down the note," he said when she'd finished. "You turned down keeping the land. I turned down being bought, Papa. There's a difference. If I'd signed, we'd have kept the 40 and lost everything that made it worth keeping. And a dozen other families would go under after us quiet one at a time, because the only person who'd found the machine agreed to look away." She reached across the table and took his rough old hand. "I need you to tell me I did right. I can carry almost anything. But I can't carry it if you think I gambled your father's land on my pride." Thomas Mercer looked at his daughter for a long moment. "When you were a girl," he said, "your grandmother told me you'd be the one, out of all of you. She said that one reads the world different, Thomas. That one sees the stitching under the cloth. Folks'll mistake her for quiet her whole life, and it'll cost 'em because quiet ain't the same as small." His eyes were wet. "I didn't rightly believe her. I spent 23 years trying to marry you off safe like you were something to be protected. And here you sit, having just faced down the meanest man in this county across my own kitchen table and won." He turned his hand over and gripped hers. "You did right. Whatever comes of it. You did more than right. You did the thing I never had the sand to do myself all these years. I've been bowing and scraping to men like him. You did right, girl. Now tell me how I help you finish it." And Adeline Mercer, who had not wept through the ballroom, or the note, or the frame, or the threat, put her head down on her father's hand, and finally for just a moment, let herself cry. Not the tears the county had wanted, not the tears of a ruined girl, but the other kind. The kind that come when you've been carrying a thing alone, and someone finally reaches down to take the other end of it. Then she wiped her face and sat up and got to work. The plan she built over the next days was patient and precise, and depended on a single dangerous piece of theater, because she'd told Renfrew the truth. Nathaniel Caldwell couldn't be told about the forgery. He had to find it. And Vivian, she was certain, was even now waiting for her own chance to put the false survey in front of him first, with her own poisoned version of the story. So Adeline would have to arrange for Nathaniel to discover the truth in a way that looked like nothing to do with her at all. She sent no writer to Caldwell. Instead, she sent one to Renfrew with a single line. "Wednesday next, the clerk takes his dinner at noon as always. See that Mr. Caldwell has cause to be at the land office at past. Ask nothing of him. Only see that he's there, and that both surveys are on the table when he comes. The rest will keep itself." Because she'd learned in the churchyard, the one thing that made the whole plan possible, that Nathaniel Caldwell's own honest curiosity about his flooded pasture, was the very hook Vivian meant to hang him with. Vivian would use it to make him distrust Adeline. Adeline would use the same hook the other way. A man that curious about his own land, standing in a land office with the true survey and a forgery of his own boundary side by side in front of him, would not be able to help himself. He'd look. And a man like Renfrew, asked an innocent question, would tell him exactly what he'd told Adeline: wrong ink, no filing, a forgery, clean and plain. And Nathaniel Caldwell would catch the lie himself, with his own eyes, on his own land, with no jilted woman anywhere near to have planted the idea. It very nearly worked exactly as she'd built it. Wednesday came. Renfrew, God bless his honest soul, did his part. Found Caldwell a reason to be at the office, contrived to have the surveys out. And Nathaniel curious, as she'd known he'd be looked. And Renfrew asked the innocent question, answered it plain. Adeline learned all this after in pieces, and she could picture the whole of it. The big quiet man bending over the two papers, going still. The cold understanding rising in him, the same as it had risen in her, that someone had forged his boundary to make a woman look like a thief. But she'd built her clever plan on one assumption, and the assumption was wrong, and it was the kind of wrongness that comes from being so busy outthinking your enemies that you forget to account for the people who love you. Because Vivian Ashcroft did not wait for a quiet moment to poison Nathaniel against Adeline. Vivian learning. Somehow that Caldwell had been at the land office, learning that her forgery had been seen by the very man it was meant to trap, but seen the wrong way, seen and caught, panicked and moved everything up, and did the one thing that turned Adeline's careful patient theater into open war. She went to Nathaniel Caldwell that same evening, before Adeline could reach him, before the dust of the land office had even settled, and she told him a story. But not the story of the survey that was ruined. Now he'd caught the forgery, he knew the paper was false. So Vivian told a different story, an uglier one that didn't need the forgery to be real. She told him that Adeline Mercer had known about the false survey all along. That Adeline had discovered it days ago and sat on it, had let it stay hidden in her father's deed box, saying nothing, planning to spring it at the perfect moment to bind Nathaniel to her cause. That the woman he'd danced with wasn't the victim of the frame. She was working it, using him, building a case, and saving the honest man of standing for the exact moment his outrage would be most useful to her. And the terrible thing, the thing that made it the deadliest lie Vivian had told yet, was that it was half true. Adeline had found the survey days ago. She had sat on it. She had been planning precisely to arrange for Nathaniel to discover the forgery at a moment of her choosing to make his outrage serve her fight. Every fact Vivian laid in front of Nathaniel Caldwell that evening was on its surface exactly true. Adeline had done all of it. The only thing false was the reason Adeline had hidden the survey, to protect him from a frame, not to use him, but the reason was invisible, and the facts were damning, and Vivian arranged them with a craftsman's care. Adeline knew none of this yet. She knew only that Wednesday had gone the way she'd planned, that Renfrew had gotten word to her that Caldwell had seen and caught the forgery, and that her theater had worked. She went to bed Wednesday night, believing she'd won the round, believing the one man whose word could carry her fight now knew the survey was false, believing the alliance was safe, believing she'd have him to stand beside her when she brought the whole machine down. She woke Thursday to a note in the yard, in a spare hard hand, pressing hard on the paper, the same hand that had once written to ask for her mind. But the words were different now. The words were cold. Miss Mercer, I've learned some things these last days that put our acquaintance in a new light. I'd thought you a woman wronged. I find you a woman who let me be lied to, and stood by silent, while a forgery of my own land sat in your father's house and made your plans around me, without the courtesy of the truth I asked of you, and you promised to give. I'll not be worked, ma'am, however good the cause. You told me once you didn't need rescuing. It seems you needed something worse, a fool with standing to point where you aimed him. I decline the office. Don't send for me again. N. Caldwell. Adeline stood in the yard with the note in her hand, and the cold Virginia morning around her, and read it twice, and understood all at once the whole shape of what Vivian had done. How the truth itself had been turned into the weapon. How her own careful cleverness had been made into the proof of her guilt. How the single man she'd counted on had been taken from her, not with a lie, but with a poisoned arrangement of the facts. She'd been so busy being clever that she'd forgotten to be honest with the one person honesty would have saved. And now the alliance was gone. The witness was gone. The one voice in the county with standing enough that it couldn't be shouted down had just declined the office and told her not to send for him again, and he'd done it believing with cause that she'd made a fool of him. Adeline Mercer stood alone in her father's yard, holding the cold note with the autumn quarter coming, and the note coming due, and the machine grinding on, and the whole county waiting still 4 days or 40 for the thrown-away girl to finally fall. And for the first time since the music stopped in that ballroom, she did not know if she'd get back up. She read the note a third time, and then she did not fall. She stood in the yard and let the cold understanding move through her that Vivian had beaten her cleanly, using the truth itself as the blade, and she felt the old familiar pull toward shame, toward the collapse the whole county was still waiting for. And she recognized it now, that pull the way you recognize a voice you've decided to stop obeying. She'd felt it in the ballroom and refused it. She'd felt it over the note and refused it. She felt it now standing in her father's yard with the one man who could have saved her fight, telling her never to send for him again, and she refused it a third time. But refusing to fall is not the same as knowing how to stand, and she knew the difference now too, and she did not pretend to herself that she'd won anything by staying upright. She'd lost Nathaniel. That was real. And the loss cut deeper than losing Julian ever had, and that frightened her because her mother had warned her of exactly this. A woman survives losing a man like Julian. She loses a man like that one. It takes something else with it, and Adeline stood in the yard and took the honest measure of the fact that somewhere in the last week, without permission, she'd begun to care what Nathaniel Caldwell thought of her. Not because he had standing, because he'd asked for her mind. And now he thought her mind was a snare. She folded the note and put it in her pocket with the other one. The Whitaker letter, the two of them together now, and she went inside to think. Her first instinct was to ride to him, to explain, to lay the whole of it out that she'd hidden the survey to protect him, that the plan hadn't been to use him, but to shield him from the very frame he now believed she'd sprung. And she got as far as the door with her cloak in her hand before she stopped because she could hear how it would sound. She could hear it in his voice, cold as the note. So you admit it. You did hide it. You did make your plans around me. And now that I've caught you at it, you've come running with a prettier reason. Every true thing she could say would land as the desperate improvisation of a woman caught scheming. The facts were against her, and the facts were every one of them true. She hung the cloak back up. "You're not going," her mother said from the kitchen doorway, watching her. "No, not yet. Maybe not at all. Because you can't explain it. Because I can't explain it in a way he'd believe. The truth's the trap, Mama. That's the wicked genius of what she did. Every fact is real. If I go and argue the facts, I lose. If I argue the reasons, I sound like a liar dressing up my scheme." Adeline sat down heavily. "There's only one thing that beats what Vivian did to me. And it's not words. It's not me telling him the reason. It's him seeing it. The same as the forgery, I couldn't tell him it was false. He had to catch it himself. I can't tell him I was protecting him. He has to watch me protect him, with nothing in it for me. Where using him is impossible. And how do you arrange a thing like that? I don't know yet." Adeline pressed her fingers to her eyes. "But I know this: the only way to prove you weren't using a man is to fight the whole war without him. To bring the machine down with him standing on the other side of the room, believing the worst of me, wanting no part of it, and to do it anyway, in a way that helps him whether he forgives me or not. If I win this, and it saves his land from the same grab, and I did it asking nothing of him, wanting nothing back then, and only then does the story flip. Then he can look at what I did and see the reason plain, because the reason will be the only thing left standing." She dropped her hands. "I have to fight it alone, Mama. All the way to the end. That's the only proof he'd ever believe." Eleanor came and sat across from her daughter and took both her hands. "You loved him," she said. "It wasn't a question. I don't know what I did. There wasn't time. There was one dance and one afternoon on a porch, and a man who asked for my mind." Adeline's voice cracked just once. "But I know I hate that he thinks I'd use him. I hate it more than I hated any of what Julian did. And I don't have the luxury of hating it, because the note's still coming due, and the machine's still grinding, and there are a dozen families in this valley about to be robbed the same as us, and I'm the only one who knows it. So I'll put the hurt in a drawer, and I'll shut the drawer, and I'll fight. And if there's anything left of him and me when the fighting's done—" She stopped. "There probably won't be. He told me not to send for him. I mean to honor that. I'll save his land without his leave and never once let him know I did it for him and not for me. That's the only clean way left." It was a good and noble plan, and it lasted exactly 2 days, because on the third day, the war stopped being about surveys and started being about her father. They came for Thomas Mercer on a Friday morning. Not the Whitakers themselves. They were far too careful for that, but a county sheriff and a lawyer and a paper. And the paper said that Thomas Mercer had defaulted on a debt of $400, that the West 40 was forfeit, and that furthermore, and here was the new cruelty, the escalation. The thing that told Adeline she'd truly frightened them by refusing the old man's bargain. Furthermore, an inquiry had been opened into whether Thomas Mercer had knowingly held forged land documents with intent to defraud his neighbor, Nathaniel Caldwell, of a portion of the Caldwell East Line. They'd turned the frame around. Adeline understood it the instant the lawyer read it out, standing on their own porch with his flat official voice. Vivian had planted the forged survey in the Mercer deed box to poison Nathaniel against Adeline. That plan had failed. Nathaniel had caught the forgery. So they'd taken the same forged survey, the same planted paper still sitting in her father's box, and repurposed it into a criminal charge. The survey was in Thomas Mercer's possession. That was a fact. It was forged. That was a fact. Therefore, Thomas Mercer possessed a forgery of his neighbor's boundary, and a man in possession of such a thing was in the eyes of the law presumed to be the forger, or at the least the fence, and the penalty for defrauding a landowner of his ground was not a lost 40 acres. It was prison. They weren't going to take the Mercer land anymore. They were going to take Thomas Mercer. And the genius of it, the cold, patient, breathtaking genius, was that it used Nathaniel Caldwell as the injured party. The charge was that Thomas Mercer had schemed against Caldwell, which meant that if Nathaniel Caldwell, believing the Mercers had schemed against him, stood up in a courtroom and said, "Yes, I found a forgery of my boundary in that man's possession. I caught it myself at the land office, every word of it true," he would, without ever intending it, hang Thomas Mercer. He would be the star witness for the prosecution. His honest outrage, the very outrage Adeline had tried to arrange to serve her, had been turned by Vivian into the rope around her father's neck. Adeline stood on the porch and watched them lead her father away. Not to a cell, not yet, but bound over, forbidden to leave the county. His good name already smoking in ruins by noon. As the news ran porch to porch, and she felt something in her go past fear, past even fury, into a cold, clear place she'd never been before. They had made a mistake. Not a legal mistake. Legally, the trap was flawless. But they had made the same human mistake every powerful person in this story had made, from Julian in the ballroom to the elder Whitaker in her parlor. They had reached for the thing that would hurt her most, believing that hurting her most would break her. And instead, they had just told her precisely, and in writing exactly where the whole rotten structure could be brought down. Because to convict her father, they needed Nathaniel Caldwell to testify that the survey in Mercer's box was a forgery of Caldwell land. And the moment Nathaniel Caldwell stood in a courtroom and swore that survey was forged, Adeline could ask him one single question in front of a magistrate: who made it? And the answer to that question: wrong ink. No filing. The Pettigrew papers. The Ashcroft family. The bought clerk was the answer that brought down not the Mercers, but the Whitakers, not the accused, but the accusers. The whole land grab laid open in the one room where truth had to be shown, and not merely liked. They had built a courtroom to destroy her father. They had, in doing so, built her the one room she'd told Renfrew she needed: a room where two pieces of paper would sit side by side, and a man of standing would be compelled under oath to say what he saw. She'd spent days trying to arrange such a room by stealth. Her enemies in their overreach had just subpoenaed one into existence. She only had to survive long enough to reach it. And she had to reach it without Nathaniel Caldwell knowing she needed him, because the second he understood that the trial he'd been dragged into as an injured party was the exact stage she needed him on. Everything she'd told her mother would come true. It would look again like she'd used him. So Adeline did a thing that cost her more than anything had yet. She let him believe the worst of her all the way to the courthouse door. She did not go to him. She did not send word. She did not defend herself when the county talk turned, as it did within a day, to whispers that the Mercer girl and her father had tried to cheat Nathaniel Caldwell out of his own land, and that his cold rejection of her at the land office had been the honest reaction of a decent man who'd caught them at it. She heard the Hale widow spread that version in her own parlor, and she did not correct it. She let it stand. Because the more the county believed Nathaniel had rejected her over an honest grievance, the more his eventual testimony would look like the neutral word of a wronged man, and the more devastating it would be when that same testimony under her careful questioning swung around and gutted the people who'd called him as a witness. She was building a weapon out of her own humiliation. Again. It was becoming the only material she had, and she'd become terribly good at working it. But building a weapon takes materials, and she still needed two. She didn't have. She needed Renfrew, willing to testify in open court, where it could cost him his livelihood, not just in a quiet office over a clerk's dinner hour. And she needed the one thing that would turn the forgery from someone did this into Vivian Ashcroft did this. She needed to connect the Pettigrew surveys to Vivian's own hand, and for that she needed a witness from inside the machine. She got the first one the hard way. She rode to Renfrew's house at dusk and found him at his own table and laid it out plain. Her father charged prison hanging over him, the trial coming and the whole thing turning on, whether one honest land office man would stand up in front of the county and swear what he'd sworn to her in private. Renfrew looked older than he had a week ago. He looked like a man who'd been lying awake. "I told you," he said quietly. "I told you they'd bury you. And now they've gone and charged your father, and you want me to stand up in open court against the Whitakers and the Ashcrofts both and say their survey's forged." He shook his head slowly. "Miss Adeline, I've got a wife with a bad hip and 40 years in that land office, and a pension. I'll lose the day I make an enemy of the men who fund the county. They'll not just fire me. They'll ruin me. They'll find a reason. They always find a reason. I know it," Adeline said. "I know exactly what I'm asking. I'm asking you to risk your whole life on the word of a jilted girl who can't even keep the one ally she had. I've no right to ask it. I know that too." She didn't beg. She'd learned that begging was just another way of agreeing to be small. "So I won't ask you to do it for me. I'll only ask you one thing, and then I'll leave you in peace whatever you decide. Old Pettigrew surveyed my grandfather's bottoms. You said he'd turn in his grave to know his life's work got used for this. You knew him. Was he the kind of man who'd want the truth told whatever it cost the man who told it? Or the kind who'd want it buried to keep a pension safe?" Renfrew was quiet a long time. "That's a low blow, Miss Adeline," he said finally, and there was the ghost of something in it that wasn't quite a smile. "It's the only kind I've got left, Mr. Renfrew. They took the rest." He looked at his own hands on the table, the hands that had filed 40 years of the county's honest paper. "He'd want it told," Renfrew said. "Pettigrew. He was a hard, fair old devil, and he'd sooner have burned his own life's work than watched it forge a lie against a neighbor. He looked up. "I'll stand up. God help my wife and my pension both. I'll stand up and say what I saw. But Miss Adeline, me saying the survey's forged only saves your father. It don't touch the Whitakers. Forged by whom they'll say, and I can't answer that. I can prove the paper's a lie. I can't prove whose hand held the pen. And without that, your father walks free maybe. But the machine grinds on, and next season, it's some other family, and the season after that, another. You want to stop it, truly. Stop it. You need to put the pen in somebody's hand. And I can't do that for you. Nobody in that land office can." There it was. The wall she'd known was coming. She could clear her father. She could not, with Renfrew alone, bring down the people who'd built the machine, and clearing her father while leaving the machine standing meant every family in the valley she'd refused to abandon was still doomed. She'd have won her own fight and lost the war she'd chosen when she turned down the Whitaker bargain. To put the pen in a hand, she needed someone from inside, and she knew riding home in the dark that there was exactly one person inside that machine who had a reason to break one person. She'd heard with her own ears in a churchyard saying, "This isn't what we agreed. I won't have my name on that. It's one thing to end a thing, it's another to rob the man." Julian, the very man who'd thrown her away in front of 300 people. The coward. The weak man she'd told herself she could work with precisely because he was weak. She'd have to go to Julian Whitaker, the author of her humiliation, and find the crack in him and pry it open and turn her own faithless fiancé into the witness who'd bring down his own father. It was, she thought, the kind of justice that was almost too perfect to be safe. She didn't go to him directly. She was past making that mistake. Instead, she waited and watched and let the county's own gossip tell her where Julian would be and when he'd be alone. And she learned that the golden match everyone had assumed would follow Julian and Vivian. The coronation the whole county had been invited to celebrate was not going as smoothly as the Hale Widows version claimed. There were whispers now under the whispers. That Miss Ashcroft had grown cold. That she'd gotten what she came north for, a foothold, a boundary, a family with a machine she could feed her father's surveys into, and that Julian Whittaker, having served his purpose in breaking the Mercer match and clearing the field, was finding himself less a bridegroom than a used tool who'd begun to ask inconvenient questions. Adeline heard it and understood it, and felt of all the unwelcome things, a flicker of something almost like pity. Julian had thrown away a real thing for a woman who'd never wanted him, only what he could be used for. He'd done to himself, unknowing exactly what he'd done to Adeline. And he was just beginning, she suspected, to feel the cold of it. A frightened, used, guilty man who's beginning to feel the cold is a man who can be reached. She reached him at the county mill of all places, where he'd gone alone on some errand of his father's, and she stepped out where he'd have to see her, and she watched him go white. Adeline. He looked hunted. You shouldn't, people will see. Let them, Julian. What's one more thing for them to talk about where you and I are concerned? She kept her voice even, almost gentle, and she watched him flinch from the gentleness, more than he'd have flinched from rage. I'm not here to make a scene. I made my scene weeks ago on a ballroom floor, if you'll recall. Or rather, you made it, and I've been paying for it ever since. I'm here for one honest conversation, which is more than you gave me the night you walked away. And then I'll leave you be. There's nothing to say. My father's handling it's all in the law's hands now, it's not for me to. Your father is going to send my father to prison, Adeline said. For a forgery your father's people committed using surveys. Vivian's family brought north for exactly that purpose. And you know it, Julian. I heard you. In the churchyard. This isn't what we agreed. I won't have my name on robbing the man. You said it. I was 6 feet away, and you never saw me, because you never once in your life saw me when there was a prettier thing to look at. She stepped closer. But you saw it that day. You saw what your father was really doing under all the talk of a formality and a youthful change of heart. You saw it, and it turned your stomach. I know it did. Because whatever you are, Julian, and you're weak, and you're a coward, and you broke something that didn't deserve breaking, you are not. I don't think quite a thief. Not in your own heart. Are you? Julian Whittaker stood at the mill with his back against the wall and his whole face coming apart. And Adeline watched the boy she'd once agreed to marry, realized that the woman in front of him was not the woman he'd thrown away, that somewhere in the wreckage he'd made, she'd become something he had no idea how to face. You don't understand, he said, and his voice broke on it. You don't understand what he is. My father. You think you saw him that night in your parlor, you saw the polite part. You don't cross him, Adeline. I've watched men who crossed him. There was a farmer over near the county line years back, thought he'd fight a note. My father. He stopped, swallowed. It doesn't matter. The point is, I can't. Whatever I saw, whatever turned my stomach, I can't. He's my father. It's my name. If I stand against him, I lose everything, the estate, the family, every dollar and every acre and every friend I've got in this world. I know exactly how much you'd lose, Adeline said quietly. I lost all of it in a single evening. Every friend. My good name. The roof near enough. My future entire. I lost it in 3 minutes on a ballroom floor while an orchestra played. And do you know what? I found out Julian standing there with all of it walking away from me on your arm. She held his eyes. I found out how much of it was never worth what I'd paid to keep it. You can lose the whole county's good opinion, and still have the one thing that matters, which is the ability to look at yourself in the glass of a morning. You've still got everything, Julian, and you can't look at yourself at all. Can you? That's the real reason you can't stop shaking. It's not fear of your father. It's that you know you've known since the churchyard that you're helping rob a decent old man to keep a life you're already ashamed of. The mill was very quiet. Somewhere the wheel turned and the water ran. "What do you want from me?" Julian whispered. And here Adeline made the hardest calculation of the whole long fight, because everything hung on it, and she could not afford to want too much or ask too soon. "Not yet," she said. "Nothing yet. I won't ask you to stand up in a courtroom against your father today because you're not ready. And a witness who breaks on the stand is worse than no witness at all. I only want you to do one thing, Julian. One small thing that nobody will ever know you did." She lowered her voice. "Your father keeps records. Every man who runs a machine like his keeps records, who owed what which notes were called, and when which surveys came from where. He can't help it. A machine that big needs its books. Somewhere in your father's papers is the ledger that ties the called notes to the moved boundaries. The Mercer note to the Caldwell line. All of it. The proof that it wasn't a dozen unlucky accidents, but one design." She let it land. "I'm not asking you to steal it. I'm asking you to know where it is. That's all. Just to know. So that when the day comes, and it's coming, Julian, with or without you, and a magistrate asks whether such a ledger exists, there's one man in that room who can say under oath, yes, and I can tell you where. You don't have to decide today whether you'll be that man. You only have to know the truth, so that if you ever find the courage, you'll have somewhere to point it." Julian stared at her. "You've changed," he said. "My God, what happened to you?" "You did," Adeline said without heat. "You and your father and Vivian and every soul in that ballroom who waited for me to fall. You made me. I ought to thank you all someday." She stepped back. "Know where the ledger is, Julian. That's all I ask. And know this too, the day is coming when you'll have to choose between the man your father is and the man you might still be. You've got a little time, not much. Use it to decide who you want to see in the glass." She left him at the mill, shaking, and she rode home, not knowing if she'd reached him or lost him, only knowing she'd planted the one seed that might grow into the hand that held the pen. And she came home to find that while she'd been at the mill, the war had come to her own door in a way she hadn't seen coming at all, because Nathaniel Caldwell's horse was in the yard. She sat frozen on her own mount for a moment, her heart doing something painful and unpermitted before she made herself dismount and go in. And there he was, in the parlor hat, in his hand standing, not sitting, standing like a man braced for a fight, and her mother nowhere in sight, and his face a storm she couldn't read. "Mr. Caldwell." She kept her voice level, though her pulse was wild. "You told me not to send for you. I've honored it. I didn't send." "You didn't?" he agreed. "That's a piece of why I'm here." He turned his hat once in his hands, the old gesture, and she hated how much she'd missed it. "I've had a hard few days, Miss Mercer. I said some things in a note I've been chewing on since. And then this morning I heard they've charged your father with defrauding me, with that survey. And I got to thinking about a thing that didn't sit right." His jaw worked. "If you were the Miss Ashcroft painted you, if you'd found that forged survey and sat on it to use against me, to bind me to your cause. Then the smart play, once I'd rejected you, once I'd walked off, would have been to come running. To use the charge against your father as the perfect excuse to get me back. Nathaniel, they're using your land to hang my papa. You have to help." He looked at her hard. "Any schemer worth the name would have been on my porch inside the hour. It's the finest lever you could ask for. And you didn't come. You let them charge your father. You let the whole county say you'd cheated me, and you never once came to use the one thing that'd have pulled me right back into your fight. Why not?" Adeline stood very still. This was the moment. Everything she'd told her mother, every hard calculation, that the only way to prove she hadn't used him was to fight the whole war without him, in a way that helped him while asking nothing back. All of it came down to whether she could hold her tongue now at the exact moment that speaking would win him and prove her a schemer, or stay silent and let the silence itself be the proof. "Because you asked me not to send for you," she said. "And because a woman who'd use a man's own land against him to save her father isn't a woman worth clearing your name for anyway. If that's what you thought I was, then me coming to beg would only prove you right. So I didn't come." She lifted her chin. I mean to clear my father without you, Mr. Caldwell. I mean to bring the whole thing down without ever asking you to lift a finger. And if it happens to save your East Line in the bargain, if it turns out the forgery that framed my father was part of a scheme that'd have robbed you too, and I stop it, then you're welcome to the benefit, and you owe me nothing for it, and you never have to think of me again. That's the only way I know to prove I wasn't working you. To fight your fight for you and take nothing for it. Even this. Even you standing in my parlor asking me why. I'm not going to use it. Now please go home, before someone sees your horse in my yard and hands Vivian one more thing to twist. Nathaniel Caldwell looked at her for a long, long moment, and something moved behind his level eyes. The same crack of light she'd seen under the locked door the night they danced wider now. Miss Ashcroft told me you'd found the survey days before and hid it, he said slowly. That part's true, ain't it? It's true. You did hide it, from me. I did. Why? And Adeline, who had sworn to herself she'd hold the reason back, who'd planned to carry it silent to the grave sooner than have it sound like an excuse, found that she could not lie to this man's plain question, not when he'd ridden all this way and asked it straight. Because if I'd brought it to you, you'd have seen your own boundary forged in my father's house, and you'd have believed I did it, she said. The frame was built to be found by you, Mr. Caldwell. Vivian planted it to poison you against me. If I'd handed it over, I'd have been handing her the win. So I hid it, and I arranged for you to find the forgery somewhere I had no hand in the land office, so you'd catch it clean, with no jilted girl anywhere near to have planted the idea. I hid it to protect you from the very frame you now think I sprang. She looked away. And Vivian took that true fact and dressed it as a scheme, and she was right to, because it does look like one, and I've no way to prove the reason. So there it is. Believe what you like. It's the truth, and the truth's the trap, and I'm too tired tonight to fight my way out of it. Go home, Mr. Caldwell. The parlor was silent. Nathaniel Caldwell stood there turning his hat, and Adeline waited for the cold to come back into his face the way it had in the note. It didn't. You hid a forgery of my own land, he said quietly, at risk of looking guilty to keep another woman from using it to turn me against you. And then when I turned against you anyway, and it cost you your one ally, and they charged your father partly on the strength of my believing the worst of you, you still didn't come to set me straight. Because setting me straight would have looked like using me. He shook his head slowly, and something like wonder came into his voice, and under it something rawer. Ma'am, in 35 years, I have never once met a soul who'd take that much hurt sooner than be misunderstood in a way that might benefit them. I've met plenty who'd lie to help themselves. I never met one who'd suffer to avoid even the appearance of it. He set his hat down on the table, deliberate a man planting a flag. I owe you an apology, a real one. I wrote you a cold, cruel note off a story a viper told me, and I never once came and asked you the plain question I should have asked, which I've only just now done standing in your parlor a week too late. You don't owe me anything. I owe you the truth I asked of you, and didn't give back, he said. You told me once you'd always be plain with me, and by God you have been at a cost I'm only now reckoning. So here's me being plain. I believe you. Every word. And I'm not going home. He met her eyes steady, the way he'd met them across a ballroom floor. You want to fight this alone to prove you weren't using me? I understand it. It's the finest, stubbornest, most infuriating reason I ever heard for turning down help. And I'm telling you now, it don't apply anymore. Because I'm not offering to help you because you asked. You didn't ask. That's the whole point. You went to every length a person could go to, not to ask, and it near broke you, and it near cost your father his freedom. So there's no using left in it. There's just a man who was wrong come to stand beside a woman who was right, because it's the decent thing, and it's a season overdue. He picked his hat back up, but only to hold it, and his voice dropped. Let me back, Adeline. Not to rescue you. You proved weeks ago you don't need rescuing, and you've been proving it every day since. Let me back to join you. It was the word I gave you the first night, and I mean to make good on it. Adeline Mercer stood in her parlor and felt the thing she'd shut in a drawer and sworn not to feel come loose all at once, and she had to press her thumbs into her fingers, the old way to keep from shaking apart, because this was the one thing she hadn't planned for. She'd planned for him to stay gone. She'd built her whole hard, lonely strategy around fighting the war without him, and she'd made her peace with it. And now here he stood, offering the one thing that undid all her careful defenses. Not rescue, which she could refuse, but partnership, which she wanted with a fierceness that scared her. "If you stand beside me," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady, "you have to understand what it costs. My father's charged. The trial's coming. And the only way I win it, the only way, is to put you on that witness stand. Mr. Caldwell, they mean to use your testimony to convict my father. I mean to use the same testimony to convict them. When you swear that survey's forged, I mean to ask you in front of the magistrate who made it, and then Renfrew, and then the ink, and then the Pettigrew papers, and then Vivian's own family, all of it laid open in the one room where it has to be shown, and not just told. You'll be the hinge the whole thing turns on. You'll make an enemy of the Whitakers and the Ashcrofts, both in open court, permanent and public. It'll cost you exactly what it's cost me. Are you certain you understand that? Because if you stand up there and lose your nerve halfway, you hang my father. There's no room for a witness who breaks." "I don't break, ma'am," Nathaniel said. "Ask anybody in this county what Caldwell's word is worth. It's about the only thing my father left me that I've kept clean." He almost smiled. "And I find the notion of watching you take those people apart in a courtroom with me for your hinge? Well, it's the first thing in 15 years I've looked forward to more than harvest." And Adeline Mercer laughed, a real one, surprised out of her the first in what felt like a year, and then she stopped, because over Nathaniel's shoulder through the parlor window, she saw a rider come up the lane at a hard gallop, and she knew before he reached the porch that something had broken. It was one of the mill hands, a boy, and he came off his horse before it had fully stopped and pounded up the steps, and her mother let him in, and he stood in the parlor doorway gasping and wild-eyed and looking straight at Adeline. Miss Mercer, you got to come, or it's young Mr. Whitaker Julian. He's—" "Slow down. What's happened to Julian?" "They found him out," the boy gasped. "His father. Somebody told the old man that Julian had been asking after the ledgers, the record books, asking where they're kept, poking around the study. And the old man's in a black fury. They say he's had Julian shut up at the estate, says his own son's turned traitor, and Miss Ashcroft." The boy's eyes were huge. "Miss Ashcroft told the old man, it was your doing, Miss Mercer, that you'd got to Julian somehow, and now the old man's swearing he'll move the trial up. He'll have your father in front of a magistrate inside the week before anything can—" The boy ran out of breath. "They're moving fast, ma'am. Whatever you're doing, they know some of it, and they're moving fast to get ahead of you." Adeline stood very still, and the whole board rearranged itself in her mind. In an instant, Julian discovered the ledger she'd asked him, only to know the location of, now the very thing that had exposed him. The trial rushed forward before her witnesses were ready, before Renfrew was prepared, before she'd built the case clean. They'd panicked. She'd frightened them into moving before she was ready, but a frightened enemy moving fast is a sloppy enemy, and a trial rushed to get ahead of her was a trial they hadn't had time to rig as carefully as they'd have liked. She turned to Nathaniel, and whatever was in her face made him set his hat down again and square his shoulders. "Well, Mr. Caldwell," she said, and her voice was steady now, cold and clear and certain, the ballroom voice, the voice that didn't shake. "You wanted to know how far I aim to go. It seems we're about to find out a great deal sooner than either of us planned. They're moving the trial up, which means everything I meant to build careful over a month, I've got to build in a week." She looked at the mill boy, and at her mother, and last and longest, at the big quiet man who'd ridden through his own pride to stand in her parlor. "So, are you still certain you want to be the hinge, because the door's about to swing whether we're ready or not?" Nathaniel Caldwell picked up his hat and put it on and tipped it to her the way he had across a ballroom floor a lifetime ago. "Ma'am," he said, "I've been waiting my whole life for a fight worth losing everything over. I reckon I finally found one. Tell me where you need me. Let's go bring these people down." They had 6 days, and Adeline spent the first of them not building her case, but stealing back the one piece of it the Whitakers thought they'd taken from her. Julian. The old man had shut his son up at the estate, believing that isolation would hold him, that a boy who'd been caught reaching for the ledgers could be frightened back into line by a locked door and a father's fury. But Adeline had learned the old man's central error weeks ago, and it was the same error every powerful person in this story kept making. He believed fear bought silence. He'd built his whole life on it, and he could not conceive of a person choosing to lose everything rather than keep it by staying quiet, because he had never once in his life made that choice himself. Julian had been making it slowly in agony since the churchyard. All he'd needed was to be shown that he wasn't alone in it. So Adeline did not try to reach Julian directly. The estate was watched now, every road, every rider. Instead, she reached him, the way water reaches a low-place patient, and sideways through the one channel his father would never think to guard the servants. The Whitaker estate ran on the labor of 40 people the old man had never once bothered to see as people, the same way he'd never seen Adeline, the same way Julian had never seen her, until it was too late. And Adeline Mercer had spent 23 years being invisible. She knew exactly how much the invisible could carry if someone thought to ask them. She sent no note. She sent her mother with a basket on a neighborly errand of condolence to the Whitaker cook whose sister had passed. Eleanor had known the woman 30 years, and in the warm kitchen over the basket, the two old women talked. The way old women talk, and a great deal passed between them that had nothing to do with the words. And by evening, Adeline knew 3 things she hadn't known that morning: that Julian was not eating, that he was not sleeping, and that he had said to the boy who brought his supper a single sentence that the boy had repeated to the cook who had repeated it to Eleanor. "Tell me if the old man, Mercer's trial goes bad. I need to know if it goes bad." A man about to abandon a cause does not ask to be told if it fails. He's still in it. Adeline said to Nathaniel that night, the two of them at the Mercer kitchen table with Renfrew. The 3 of them building the case by candlelight, the way she'd once sat alone building the first page of it. "He's frightened half to death, and his father's got him locked up, but he's still in it. He asked to know if my father's trial goes bad. That's not a man washing his hands. That's a man waiting for his moment, and terrified he'll miss it." "Then we give him his moment," Nathaniel said, "in open court where the old man can't shut a door on it." "We can't call him," Renfrew warned. "A witness the defense hasn't prepared hostile to his own family. The magistrate won't compel him, and even if he did, Julian could break on the stand and take your whole case down with him. You put a scared boy up there and let his father stare him down, he'll fold." "I know it." Adeline turned her cup slowly. "Which is why we don't call him. We build the case so that Julian doesn't have to be brave first. We build it so tight so far that by the time it needs him, the only thing left for him to do is finish it. And finishing a thing that's already 3/4 done takes a great deal less courage than starting it. We make it so that when Julian's moment comes, stepping into it is easier than staying out. That's how you move a coward, Mr. Caldwell. Not by asking him to leap. By narrowing the ground under him until forward's the only way that isn't down." Nathaniel looked at her across the candle, and there was that thing in his face again, the not-quite smile that had become something warmer over the past days. "Remind me," he said, "never to get on the wrong side of you." "You already were," Adeline said. "You came back. That's how I know you're smart." The second day they lost Renfrew. Not to fear, to force. The old man moved faster than even the mill boy had warned. Renfrew came to the Mercer place at dawn, gray and shaking, and told them that he'd been dismissed from the land office the evening before, effective at once. 40 years ended in a sentence, and that worse than the dismissal was the quiet word that had come with it. That any testimony a disgraced former clerk might offer a man, let go for cause, would carry the weight of sour grapes and nothing more. They'd fired him not to silence him, but to poison his word before he ever spoke it. A witness could be answered. A discredited witness answered himself. "I told you," Renfrew said, and he wasn't reproaching her, he was grieving. "I told you they'd find a reason. They always find a reason. And now my 40 years is the reason. I'll stand up if you still want me. Miss Adeline, but I'll do you more harm than good up there now. They'll say I'm a bitter old man let go for cause, saying anything to spite the men who let me go. I've become worthless to you. I'm sorry. God, I'm sorry. And Adeline sat with the ruin of her chief witness in front of her, the man whose word was supposed to prove the forgery. And she did the thing she'd learned to do in a ballroom. She did not let the loss land as despair. She turned it over fast, looking for the shape of it, looking for the stitching under the cloth. "They fired you the day before the trial," she said slowly. "Why the day before? If they wanted you discredited, they could have done it weeks ago. Why wait until the very eve?" Renfrew blinked. I don't know. To catch me by surprise, I'd reckon. To rattle me." "No." Adeline was standing now, moving the cold clarity coming over her. "No. They waited because they couldn't do it before. You said it yourself weeks ago, a clerk who's been paid to look the other way. The clerk. The one who takes his dinner at noon, who let the forged survey pass, who's been bought. If they fired you weeks ago, you'd have had weeks to make trouble, to talk, to file complaints, to make yourself heard. But if they fire you the night before the trial..." She turned to Nathaniel. "They needed you in that office right up until the last minute. Why? What did the land office have that they needed kept quiet until the eve of trial, that a loyal, disgruntled clerk might have spilled if he'd had more time?" Renfrew went very still. "The transfer records," he said softly. "Sweet Lord, the Pettigrew papers. When old Pettigrew died and his surveys went to his son-in-law Ashcroft, that transfer came through the office. It's filed. There's a record of exactly which surveys the Ashcroft family took possession of and when. And if a man cross-referenced that list against every boundary that's been quietly amended in this county the past 2 years..." He looked up, and his face had changed entirely. "Miss Adeline, it's all there, in the office. Filed proper in my own hand because I filed it. The proof that the Ashcrofts hold the surveys, and the list of every line that's moved. I don't need to be a believed witness. I just need the records. Paper doesn't have sour grapes. Paper can't be a bitter old man. Paper just is. And the records are in the office," Adeline said, "which you no longer have access to, because they fired you last night, which is..." "Exactly why they fired me last night?" Renfrew finished wondering. "Not to discredit my word, to take my keys, to lock the one door I could have walked through to pull those files." The whole room understood it at once. It hadn't been about Renfrew's testimony at all. It had been about the building. About locking the records away where a dismissed clerk couldn't reach them, and a jilted girl had no standing to demand them one day before the trial, so that the paper trail that could hang them all would sit sealed behind an official door until the trial was safely lost and the files could quietly disappear. They'd outthought her. Again. They'd taken the one form of proof that couldn't be discredited and put it behind a lock she couldn't pick. Except... Adeline turned very slowly to Nathaniel Caldwell. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "who has the standing to demand access to filed land records concerning his own property, records of amendments to the Caldwell East Line, and the transfer of the very surveys those amendments were forged from." Nathaniel Caldwell began slowly to smile. "Why?" he said. "I reckon a landowner does, Miss Mercer. I reckon a man's got every right in the world to inspect the county's records touching his own dirt. I reckon there's not a clerk nor a magistrate in Virginia could refuse a man his own boundary records without answering some mighty uncomfortable questions about why." "They locked the door against a fired clerk and a ruined girl," Adeline said. "They forgot the door opens for you. It always opened for you. That's the thing they can never remember. The men like the Whitakers, that the standing they use as a weapon cuts both ways, and they've just spent a week handing me the one man in this county whose standing they can't lock out. I'll have those records in my hand by noon," Nathaniel said, rising, "or I'll know the reason why in front of witnesses, which serves us near as well." He had them by 11. He walked into the land office where a new clerk sat nervous behind Renfrew's old desk, and he asked plain and quiet to inspect every filed record touching the Caldwell East Line and the Pettigrew survey transfers, and the clerk who had been paid to obstruct a fired man and a jilted girl, and had no instruction whatsoever for what to do when the largest landowner in the valley walked in and asked to see his own papers, obstructed for exactly as long as it took Nathaniel Caldwell to say, "Son, you can hand me those files, or you can explain to the magistrate tomorrow why you refused a man his own boundary records the day before a forgery trial that turns on them. I'll wait while you decide. Take your time." The clerk handed him the files. And in them was everything the transfer of the Pettigrew surveys to the Ashcroft family dated and filed. The amendment to the Caldwell East line, the forged one with its wrong ink and its false date, sitting right there in the record where it had been slipped in. And when Renfrew and Adeline and Nathaniel spread it all across the Mercer kitchen table that afternoon and worked through it line by line into the night, the pattern. 11 boundaries moved in 2 years. 11 farms. Every one of them a family that had borrowed from the Whitakers. Every amendment forged from a Pettigrew survey. Every one filed past the same bought clerk. It was all there in the county's own honest paper, filed in Renfrew's own careful hand. The machine laid open, unable to plead sour grapes, unable to be stared down, unable to break on a witness stand, because it was not a witness. It was the truth written down, waiting all this time in a drawer for someone who read every line to come and find it. They built their whole scheme on paper, Adeline said softly, looking at it spread across the table in the candlelight. Because paper made it legal. Because paper made it safe. And they never once imagined that the paper they hid behind was the exact thing that would bury them. That the same records that made it lawful made it provable. They were so certain no one would look. So certain the wronged would go quiet. She touched the edge of the transfer record. Grandmother was right. Quiet isn't the same as small. They walked into the courthouse on the 6th day. The old man had wanted a fast trial. A quiet trial. A foregone conclusion. Thomas Mercer in front of a friendly magistrate. The forged survey produced Caldwell's grievance, noted the verdict delivered before the county had quite finished its breakfast. He got instead a courtroom packed to the walls because a thing had gotten out. Adeline had seen to that. The same channels, the servants, the mill, the invisible network she'd learned to move through, and the county that had come to a ballroom to watch the Mercer girl fall had come now to watch whatever this was, and the room was full to bursting with every family for 40 miles. Vivian Ashcroft was there seated near the front, beautiful and cold and certain. The elder Whitaker was there gray and correct, and Nathaniel Caldwell was there called by the prosecution as the injured party. The man the Mercers had supposedly schemed against seated, where the old man had put him believing still that Caldwell's testimony was the rope. Julian was not there. Julian was locked at the estate. Adeline had seen to that too. In her way she'd sent no word to Julian at all. These past days had made no attempt to spring him or reach him, and she'd done it deliberately because she needed the old man to believe his son was contained. Needed him unwatched and unworried about Julian, right up until the moment it was too late. The prosecution went first, and it went exactly as the old man had built it. The forged survey was produced. It was established that it had been found in Thomas Mercer's possession, in his own deed box in his own house. The county's own new clerk testified nervous that the survey concerned the Caldwell East line. And then the prosecution called Nathaniel Caldwell to establish the injury to have him swear as the wronged landowner that the document was a forgery of his boundary, so that the possession of it by Thomas Mercer would stand as the crime. They put Nathaniel Caldwell on the stand to hang Thomas Mercer. And Adeline Mercer, who as the daughter of the accused had been granted leave to question witnesses, a thing the old man had allowed with contempt, seeing no danger in a jilted girl asking questions of the man who'd rejected her rose when the prosecution had finished to cross-examine. The room leaned in. This, they thought, was the spectacle the ruined woman forced to question the very man who'd spurned her at the land office, the final humiliation the Mercer girl brought low one last time. "Mr. Caldwell," Adeline said, and her voice was steady and clear, and it carried to the walls the way a low voice carries in a room gone quiet. "You've sworn that the survey found in my father's possession is a forgery of your own East line. You're certain of it?" "I am, ma'am." Nathaniel's voice was grave. "I've seen the true survey of my land 100 times. That one's been altered. The boundaries moved." "How can you be sure it's altered and not simply mistaken? A man makes an error with a pen." "Because I saw the true survey and the false one side by side, ma'am, at the land office some weeks back. The false one's a copy of the real with the line redrawn by hand and a false filing date stamped on it. It's forged. There's no mistake in it. It's a lie made careful on purpose. You saw them side by side, at the land office." Adeline let it sit. "Who showed them to you?" Mr. Renfrew that kept the office 40 years. The same Mr. Renfrew who was dismissed from that office the night before this trial. A stir in the room. The old man's eyes narrowed. The same, Nathaniel said. We'll come back to why a man gets fired the very night before he might testify. First, Mr. Caldwell, you say the survey is forged. Forged means someone made it. A false thing has a maker. She stepped closer to the stand. In your judgment as the landowner whose boundary was forged, could a person have made that copy from memory? Or would they have needed the true survey of your land in front of them to forge it so exactly? They'd have needed the true one, Nathaniel said. You can't forge a boundary that close from memory. You'd need the real map. And how many true copies of that survey exist? Mr. Caldwell. 3. His voice was very steady now. 1 in the land office file. 1 in my own house which has never left it, and 1 held by the family of the surveyor who drew it old Pettigrew when he died, and his papers passed to his heirs. And who, Adeline said into a silence so complete she could hear the courthouse clock, are Pettigrew's heirs? Nathaniel Caldwell looked for the first time past Adeline directly at Vivian Ashcroft, seated pale and rigid in the front row. His daughter married a man named Ashcroft, he said. Of Charleston. The surveys passed to that family. It's in the transfer record filed at the land office in Mr. Renfrew's own hand. The room broke into noise. The magistrate called for order. The elder Whitaker was on his feet, his lawyer with him objecting. This was irrelevant. This was a jilted woman's fantasy. This had nothing to do with whether Thomas Mercer possessed a forged document. On the contrary, Adeline said, turning to the magistrate, and she produced from the folder in her hands the transfer record and Renfrew's filed amendments and the pattern they'd built across a kitchen table by candlelight. It has everything to do with it, Your Honor. The prosecution asks you to convict my father for possessing a forgery. I mean to show you who made it and why it was placed in my father's house, and that it is one of 11 such forgeries used to steal the best land off 11 families in this valley. All of them. Everyone drawn from the Pettigrew surveys, now held by the Ashcroft family. All of them filed past a single clerk. All of them tied to notes, called by a single lender. She laid the papers before the bench. My father did not possess a forgery to defraud Mr. Caldwell. My father possessed a forgery because it was planted in his house to be found first to poison Mr. Caldwell against our family, and when that failed, to charge my father with the very crime committed by the people accusing him. It is all here, Your Honor. In the county's own records. Filed in an honest man's hand. It does not need me to be believed. It only needs you to read it. The magistrate read it. The room waited while he read it, and Adeline stood before the bench with her chin level and her hands steady, and did not look at Vivian, did not look at the old man, did not look at anyone but the magistrate turning the pages, and she felt standing there the whole long arc of it, come round the ballroom where she'd refused to fall the porch where a man had asked for her mind, the churchyard where she'd heard the truth, the kitchen table where she'd written the first page of this exact moment by candlelight, believing even then that it would come. It had come. The magistrate looked up. His face was grim, and it was not aimed at Thomas Mercer. These are serious records, he said slowly. If they are what they appear to be. He turned to the prosecution's table to the elder Whitaker's lawyer. I'll hear an explanation for why 11 boundaries in this county have been amended from surveys held by the family of a witness in this very room, and I'll hear it now. And it might have ended. There might have ended in an inquiry, a delay. The machine wounded, but not killed. The powerful men marshaling their lawyers to muddy and delay, and survive the way powerful men do. Adeline had proven the forgery. She had proven the pattern. But she had not yet put the pen in a hand, and she knew it. Renfrew had warned her weeks ago that paper could prove the what, but not always the who, and the Ashcrofts and Whitakers could still claim the surveys had been stolen from them, misused without their knowledge that they were victims too. It was the last defense, and it was a good one, and Adeline had no way past it. She needed the one witness who could stand up and say no, it was no theft, it was a scheme, and I watched it built. The courthouse doors opened. Julian Whitaker walked in. He was disheveled, and he was pale, and he had plainly ridden hard. He'd broken out of his father's locked estate. Adeline learned later, had climbed from a window like a boy, and stolen a horse, and ridden through the night on the strength of a single sentence carried to him by a servant girl. The only message Adeline had ever sent him, not a plea, not a summons, just the truth. The trial is the 6th day. Your father means you contained. Whatever you decide, it as a free man. She'd sent it, and then left him entirely alone to choose, because she'd learned you cannot make a coward brave by pushing him. You can only clear the ground, and let him find in his own time that forward is the only way that isn't down. He'd found it. The elder Whitaker came out of his chair with his son's name in his mouth like a curse. "Julian, you will not. I will, father." Julian's voice shook, and it did not stop him, and that was the thing Adeline would remember, that he was terrified, plainly, wholly terrified, and he did it anyway, which is the only kind of courage that ever counts. "I've been ashamed for weeks. I've been ashamed since the churchyard, since before that, since the ballroom. I let you tell me it was a formality. I let you tell me a lot of things." He walked to the front of the room past his father's grasping hand and stood before the magistrate. "Your Honor, my name is Julian Whitaker. I know where the ledger is. My father's ledger that ties every called note to every moved boundary. I've seen it. I can tell you the farm and the family for every one of those 11 lines, because I heard them planned at my father's own table. And I'll swear to all of it under oath right now, if you'll have me the whole design from the beginning, including the note called on Thomas Mercer, and the survey planted in his house, which I heard Miss Ashcroft propose with my own ears." The room erupted. The magistrate hammered for order. Vivian Ashcroft rose halfway from her seat, and for one instant her mask came fully off in front of the entire county. The fury, the disbelief, the calculating panic of a woman watching her design collapse, and then she sat back down, because there was nothing left to do, because a scheme built on the certainty that no one would talk had just been undone by the one man everyone had been most certain would stay silent. They had built the whole thing on the belief that the weak stay quiet and the wronged go away. And they had lost to a thrown-away girl who would not go away, and a cold man who came back, and a fired clerk who filed the truth in his own honest hand, and a coward who found at the last that he would rather be ruined and able to look at himself in the glass than safe and unable to. The rest went quickly, the way things go quickly once the keystone's pulled. Julian testified, shaking the whole time, and did not break. Renfrew's records were entered and stood because paper does not have sour grapes. The pattern was established, the 11 farms, the scheme laid open in the one room where truth had to be shown. Thomas Mercer was cleared of every charge before the day was out, and the magistrate ordered an inquiry into the Whitaker notes and the Ashcroft surveys that would over the following months unwind every one of the 11 thefts, return the stolen ground to the families it had been taken from, and see the elder Whitaker's untouchable name become in that county exactly the thing he'd threatened to make of the Mercers, a byword for a man who robbed his neighbors and was caught. Vivian Ashcroft left Virginia within the week. There was nothing to hold her, no charge quite stuck to her that a Charleston fortune couldn't slip. But there was also nothing left for her to take, and a county that had nearly crowned her had learned exactly what she was, and a woman like Vivian could not abide being seen. She went back south, and the last anyone in that valley heard of her, she was the same as she'd always been, only in a new place that didn't yet know her. Some people do not learn. They only relocate. Julian Whitaker did not relocate. He stayed, and he faced it, and he lost nearly everything he'd been so afraid to lose. The estate went into the inquiry, the family name went into the dirt, the friends fell away. And Adeline watched him bear it, and found that the pity she'd felt for him at the mill had turned into something plainer and more respectful, because a man who does the right thing and pays the full price for it without flinching and without asking to be thanked, has earned the right to be called something other than a coward. She never loved him again. That door had shut in a ballroom and stayed shut. But she came to think of him in time as a man who'd been weak once in the worst possible moment, and then spent the rest of his life proving it wasn't the whole of him. There are worse things to become. As for Adeline Mercer, she did not marry Nathaniel Caldwell that season, and it surprised the county which had assembled the ending. It wanted the moment. Julian sat down. The ruined girl vindicated, saved at last by the rich landowner. the rejection to acceptance arc closed with a wedding all tidy. The county was disappointed, because Adeline Mercer had learned the one lesson the whole ordeal had been teaching her from the first backward step on a ballroom floor, and she was not about to unlearn it now for the sake of a tidy ending. She'd walked into that ballroom a year ago believing her worth was measured by whose hand she'd leave on. She had spent the year discovering in the cruelest way that it never had been. And she was not going to end that year by handing the measure of herself to a different man's hand, however good the man, however much she'd come to want him. First, she was going to be plainly and publicly, and on her own, the thing she'd become. So she did what her grandmother had seen in her from the start, what her father had spent 23 years trying to protect her out of. She took the small consulting fee the returned families pressed on her. For it was Adeline. Everyone knew now who'd read every line, who'd found the thread and pulled it, and she used it to open a small practice, the first of its kind. That valley had seen a woman who read papers before people signed them. Notes, deeds, surveys, contracts. She sat across her own table from farmers and widows and men who'd have crossed the street to avoid a jilted girl a year before, and she read the fine print they couldn't, and she caught the traps laid for them, the way she'd caught the one laid for her father. And slowly, quietly, she became the one person in that county the powerful could no longer count on going unread. She became, in short, exactly what the Whitakers had feared. A woman who reads every line sitting in the open for hire where anyone could reach her. And Nathaniel Caldwell courted her the whole while. Slow, plain, respectful, the way he did everything. He did not press. He'd understood before she'd said a word why she needed to stand on her own ground first, and he'd said only, "Take whatever time you need, ma'am. I've got nothing but land and time, and I told you once I'd grown curious how far you aim to go. I find I'm still curious. I'll be here for the whole of it." And he was. He rode over on Sundays. He asked her about drainage, and she told him, and he took her advice and saved his pasture, and they built the thing. The way she'd been unwilling to build anything with a man before, out in the open as equals on ground she owned herself. It was a full year later that he asked her, and he asked her in the one place that mattered. The county held its annual ball again in the same grand hall, and Adeline went not on anyone's arm. She never did learn to arrive on an arm. It was too late for that, and she'd stopped wishing it weren't. She went alone in a gown that was hers, bought with money she'd earned, and she walked into the room where a year before she'd been left standing in front of 300 people and waited on to fall. The room remembered. She felt it remember. And this time when she walked in, the whispers were of an entirely different kind. Nathaniel Caldwell crossed the floor to her. He crossed it the same way he had the first time, unhurried, the crowd parting, and he stopped before her and took off his hat and held it in both hands, and the room went quiet, the way it had gone quiet a year ago. 300 people leaning in, but for a different ending now, a hoped-for one. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Mr. Caldwell. A year ago I crossed this floor because I couldn't stand to watch 'em wait for you to fall." He turned his hat once in his hands. "I'll be plain the way I've always been plain with you, and the way you asked me to be that first night. I didn't cross it to rescue you. You proved you didn't need it. I crossed it to join you. It was the word I gave you, and I've tried to make good on it every day since." He looked at her steady. "I'm not here tonight to save you either, Adeline. You've saved yourself and your father and half the families in this valley, and you did most of it with me, standing on the wrong side of a room believing a lie. You don't need a thing from me. That's exactly why I can ask you what I'm about to ask." He did not kneel. He knew her too well to kneel. He held out his hand, open palm up the way he had the first time. Not to lean on, just to walk beside. "Will you marry me, and let me spend the rest of my life keeping up with a woman I've never once managed to get ahead of?" And Adeline Mercer looked at the open hand. The same open hand, in the same room a year and a lifetime later. And this time she did not take it because it was the only hand offered, or because taking it would save her, or because a woman was supposed to leave on someone's arm. She took it because she had built a self-worth offering on her own ground in the open, where the whole county could see it, and she was choosing freely as an equal with everything to her own name to share that self with a man who'd never once asked her to be smaller than she was. "Yes," she said. "I'll walk beside you, Nathaniel. Not ahead, not behind. Beside." And then, because she was still herself, and always would be, she added, "But I'll go on reading every contract in this county before anyone signs it, and I'll not stop for a wedding ring, and if that troubles you, you'd best say so now." Nathaniel Caldwell threw back his head and laughed there in front of 300 people, the cold man who never danced and never laughed, and he drew her into the frame of the waltz that was just beginning. "Trouble me," he said, turning her out onto the floor where she'd once been left standing alone. "Ma'am, it's the only thing I ever wanted. A woman who reads every line. Marry me and read the whole county to rights, and I'll count myself the luckiest man in Virginia for the privilege of holding your coat while you do it." They danced, and the county watched, and this time there was no waiting for anyone to fall, because everyone in that room had finally learned the thing Adeline Mercer had learned a year before on that same floor in the cruelest hour of her life, that a woman's worth was never measured by the man who chose her, or the man who threw her away, or the man who crossed a room to reach her. It was measured by the courage she showed when the whole world turned its back and waited for her to break. And Adeline Mercer had not broken. She never once had, and she never would again. And every soul in that valley knew it now, and would know it for the rest of their lives, because a quiet woman who reads every line had walked into the very room built to destroy her, and had left it standing taller than anyone in it, not saved, not rescued, not chosen, but free and equal, and entirely unbreakably her own.